The story of World War I that you learned in school is incomplete, sanitized, and stripped of the real human experience that unfolded in the muddy trenches of Europe. Beyond the bullets, beyond the barbed wire, beyond the death tolls and battlefield. Maps, there was another war being fought, a war of loneliness, desire, and forbidden intimacy. In 2023, a leak shocked the historical community when a French historian uncovered a sealed wooden box labeled Correspondance Interdite, meaning forbidden correspondence, hidden away in the basement of a crumbling chateau near Amiens. Inside were 376 letters from soldiers between 1915 and 1918. Letters never delivered. Letters never meant for public eyes. These were not letters about war strategies or patriotic oaths. They were confessions of secret desires, physical encounters, and the emotional collapse of men isolated from the world, trapped in a landscape where human touch was rare and survival blurred moral lines. One of these letters came from Captain Henry Duncan of the British 2nd Battalion, written to his wife Anna, but never sent. In it, he wrote about the cold, about the unbearable nights, and about Private Evans, who sometimes reached for his hand under the shared blanket. Captain Duncan admitted to feelings he did not understand, acts he could not name, and emotions he could no longer control. His letter ended up in the forbidden box because he never mailed it. He folded it and kept it close to his heart until he died at the Battle of the Somme. This story is not unique. Across the trenches of World War I, soldiers were not just battling the enemy across no man's land. They were battling their own isolation, their own craving for intimacy, and the suffocating fear of dying without ever feeling human again. In the trench system, privacy was non-existent. Men slept shoulder to shoulder, body to body, wrapped together under thin blankets to survive the freezing nights. At first, it was just about warmth, but as the months dragged into years, the lines between brotherhood and physical closeness blurred. In whispered voices, some soldiers referred to younger privates as body slaves, unofficial companions who were expected to clean boots, polish buttons, and sometimes share beds. This was not official military policy, but it was part of trench life, a secret system of comfort and survival that no one wanted to admit. A French soldier once wrote, "Les nuits sont longues, les corps sont faibles," meaning the nights are long and the bodies are weak. This was the silent agreement of the trenches. But the search for human connection did not stop with fellow soldiers. When troops were granted leave, many sought out women in nearby villages. Entire economies of wartime prostitution developed around military outposts. In places like Amiens and Arras, French women operated red card brothels, government-regulated, establishments where soldiers could temporarily escape the horrors of war for the comfort of another's body. These encounters were not always transactional. Some soldiers fell in love with local women, forming attachments that complicated their loyalties to wives waiting back home. Soldiers often sent letters to their spouses confessing their guilt or pleading for understanding, but many of these letters never made it to the post. Instead, they were burned, torn up, or hidden away in personal diaries that were later destroyed. Some soldiers, unable to face the reality of their emotional betrayals, took drastic actions. There are recorded cases of suicide in the trenches, not from combat trauma, but from the shame of broken vows and forbidden desires. One Canadian soldier, after confessing to a chaplain about an affair with another man in his unit, shot himself in his tent, leaving behind a note that read, "I died twice, once in the trenches, and again when I could not live with myself." The fear of disease added another layer of complication. Venereal disease spread rapidly among troops who visited brothels, leading military doctors to issue warnings and distribute rudimentary protections, though many soldiers ignored them. Some wore medallions of Saint Roch, the patron saint of plagues, around their necks not for the battlefield, but for the bedroom. Beyond the physical encounters, emotional manipulation became a currency in the trenches. Soldiers who shared intimate moments sometimes used them as leverage. There are letters describing situations where one soldier threatened to expose another's secret unless they performed favors or kept silent about other infractions. Love became transactional. Emotional blackmail replaced camaraderie. War reduced men to their most basic instincts, and for many, that meant reaching for whatever comfort they could find, no matter the cost to their conscience. The reality of trench life was not just about fighting the enemy. It was about surviving the crushing weight of human need. These men were thousands of miles from home, living in mud, sleeping beside corpses, watching friends die daily. In that environment, the hunger for touch, for love, for some form of human connection became as urgent as the need for food or water. Some wrote letters to their wives, confessing that they had failed them, begging for forgiveness. Others never wrote at all, choosing instead to bury their guilt deep within, hoping the war would end before they had to face their own reflections. Families back home often found pieces of these stories when soldiers' belongings were returned. After death letters with half-finished confessions, diaries with pages ripped out, and photos of women no one recognized. There were even rumors of photographs of male companions, carefully hidden, sometimes destroyed by grieving mothers, wives who didn't understand or didn't want to know the truth. The official history books ignored this side of the war. Governments and militaries preferred the narrative of honor, bravery, and sacrifice, not the messy reality of human desire. But the letters tell a different story. They reveal a world where soldiers became lovers, where friendships turned into secret romances, where the boundaries of masculinity were rewritten not by choice, but by necessity. This was not about politics or patriotism. It was about staying alive, staying sane, and finding something, anything, that made the nightmare of war bearable for one more night. This hidden history has remained in the shadows for over a century. But now, piece by piece, it is coming to light. The forbidden letters, the burned pages, the whispered stories, they are the real testimony of what happened when men were pushed beyond their limits, when love and lust became part of survival. And this is just the beginning. In the next chapter, we will go deeper into the diaries of trench soldiers, uncovering more secrets about affairs, betrayals, and the complex web of relationships that held these men together, and sometimes tore them apart. The deeper you go into the world of trench warfare, the more you realize that war is not just about killing, it's about surviving the spaces between death, the long stretches of cold nights, wet uniforms, and restless thoughts. In those spaces, soldiers in World War I developed relationships and coping mechanisms that official histories have either ignored or deliberately erased. While bullets and bombs claimed lives in no man's land, secret affairs and emotional entanglements flourished behind the sandbags. The Diaries of Trench. Soldiers reveal stories not of heroism in battle, but of desperate attempts to maintain their humanity amid chaos. There was Corporal James Fallow, a 24-year-old from Liverpool, who wrote in his diary not about the Germans, but about a French woman named Elise, whom he met in a small village near the Somme. Elise was not a prostitute. She was a widow whose husband had died in the first months of the war. When Fallow stumbled into her home during a leave from the front, shivering and covered in mud, she gave him soup, then her bed, and eventually her body. They did not speak the same language, but war has its own vocabulary. For the next 6 months, Fallow visited Elise whenever he could. He wrote, "I have a wife at home, but I cannot think of England when I am with her. She is not just comfort. She is escape." But Fallow was not the only soldier seeking solace in the arms of local women. Entire units developed informal arrangements with villages, where women provided food, warmth, and intimacy in exchange for protection or small luxuries like soap or chocolate. Some soldiers sent part of their wages to these women instead of their families back home. Others made promises of marriage they knew they could not keep. Affairs flourished in the shadows of war because everyone understood the unspoken rule. Tomorrow was never guaranteed, so tonight had to be lived fully. Yet these affairs came with consequences. There are records of soldiers fathering children in France and Belgium, then disappearing back into the war, leaving behind women and babies with no legal or financial support. Some women wrote letters to military commanders begging for help, but these letters were often ignored or destroyed. To protect the Army's reputation, the British War Office feared that scandals involving illegitimate children would damage morale and discipline. Meanwhile, soldiers themselves carried the guilt of these relationships, knowing that if they survived the war, they would have to face wives and families who believed they had been faithful. But not all affairs involved women. Trench diaries also reveal a hidden network of same-sex relationships, often formed out of necessity, but sometimes out of genuine affection. Soldiers like Private William Cross of the 5th Infantry wrote about falling in love with his tent mate, a fellow private named Stephen. In one entry, Cross described lying awake at night, listening to Stephen breathe, wanting to reach out but afraid of being court-martialed if anyone found out. Eventually, the isolation and fear gave way to action. One night, after a bombardment left them both shaken and covered in dirt, Cross kissed Stephen in the darkness of their dugout. To his surprise, Stephen kissed him back. Their relationship continued in secret, hidden from their commanding officers, but known to a few trusted friends. In the war, friendships often became something more, a form of emotional survival against the cold brutality of combat. These relationships were not just about sex. They were about connection, about feeling human when everything else felt mechanical and dehumanized. The danger was not just from bullets, but from discovery. If caught, soldiers could face severe punishment. Official military policy criminalized homosexuality, and soldiers found guilty of indecency could be imprisoned or discharged in disgrace. But enforcement was inconsistent. In some cases, commanding officers turned a blind eye because they understood the psychological toll the trenches took on their men. In other cases, soldiers used these secrets as leverage. Diaries mention cases where one soldier blackmailed another, threatening to expose their relationship unless they received extra rations, better sleeping conditions, or favors. Emotional blackmail became part of trench politics. There were also instances of sexual assault, dark corners of trench life that no one wanted to acknowledge. Power dynamics between ranks sometimes led to coerced relationships with higher ranking officers exploiting younger soldiers who had no way to refuse. These acts were rarely reported, not because they did not happen, but because the chain of command protected its own. Victims remained silent, fearing both the enemy's bullets and their comrades' judgment. Beyond the trenches, wives and families back home lived in their own world of secrets and betrayals. Women left behind often struggled with loneliness and uncertainty. Some entered into affairs of their own, seeking comfort in the arms of other men while their husbands were away. There were cases where wives believed their husbands were dead and remarried, only for the original husband to return months later, alive but emotionally destroyed by both the war and the betrayal. Soldiers received letters from home that shattered their mental state. One letter from a soldier's wife, discovered in the forbidden box of correspondence, read, "I cannot live as a widow when I am still young. Forgive me, but I have found someone new." Such letters led to breakdowns, desertions, and even suicides. The psychological weight of war was not just about witnessing death. It was about carrying the burden of love gone wrong. Marriage became A ghost for many soldiers, a distant memory they could not hold on to in the mud and blood of the front lines. Religion offered little comfort. Chaplains in the trenches often heard confessions of sexual sins, but even they struggled to offer guidance. Some chaplains secretly advised soldiers to do whatever they needed to survive emotionally, turning a blind eye to behaviors they would normally condemn. War forced everyone to redefine morality. For many, the greatest sin was not infidelity, but losing the will to live. Some military medical officers noted that soldiers who engaged in relationships, whether with local women or fellow soldiers, often exhibited fewer signs of shell shock. Intimacy, in whatever form, became a psychological medicine. The military unofficially tolerated certain behaviors because they recognized that men cut off from human touch became unstable. Soldiers who had someone to write to, someone to touch, someone to whisper to in the darkness, often survived longer, not just physically, but mentally. But when the war ended, these relationships could not follow the soldiers home. Many men returned to their wives and families, pretending nothing had happened, burying their memories as deeply as the bodies left behind on the battlefields. Some wrote final letters to their wartime lovers and then burned them. Others cut all ties, leaving women and children in foreign countries without explanation or support. The emotional wreckage of these decisions lingered for decades. Some veterans drank themselves into oblivion. Others committed suicide years after the war, unable to reconcile their trench life with civilian expectations. Their families never understood why their husbands, brothers, and sons came back as different men, silent, distant, haunted by more than just combat. The diaries and letters they left behind, when they survived it all, tell a story of love and sex that history books refuse to acknowledge. The war was not just a battlefield. It was a breeding ground for emotional survival mechanisms that broke all the rules. Soldiers became lovers. Strangers became family. Marriages dissolved silently while bodies lay side by side in the mud. The human heart does not follow military orders, and in the chaos of World War I, Isaiah found a way to survive the trenches. Even when no one else did, the trenches of World War I were not just battlegrounds of flesh and steel. They were emotional landscapes where the human psyche bent and sometimes broke under the unbearable weight of existence. While governments kept propaganda machines churning out posters of honor, sacrifice, and stoic masculinity, the reality for millions of young men in the mud was far more fragile, vulnerable, and intimate. For some, love was not something left back home. It became something created right there in the filth, improvised out of necessity. It was Lieutenant Robert Jennings, a 30-year-old English officer stationed near Ypres, who began his war believing in Victorian ideals of honor and discipline. But after 2 years in the trenches, those ideals dissolved. Jennings kept a private journal, hidden inside the false bottom of his ammunition box, where he detailed his slow descent from stiff upper-lip patriot to desperate man seeking human closeness wherever it could be found. He wrote of a fellow officer, Charles, a quiet man from Devonshire, with whom he shared rations and war stories at first, and later shared his body during the long freezing nights when sleep wouldn't come. And the sound of rats scratching in the walls was louder than any shell. Jennings wrote, "I do not know if this is love or madness, but in the cold of the trenches, his hand is warmer than any blanket." These were not isolated incidents. Similar stories unfolded across national lines. German soldiers wrote letters, confessing their forbidden attachments to fellow comrades, using coded language to avoid detection. French poilus scribbled diary entries at the special brotherhoods that formed in the dark. Some referred to themselves as les frères de nuit, the brothers of the night. For many soldiers, these relationships were not just sexual. They were emotional lifelines, ways to cope with the unimaginable horror of trench warfare. The relentless proximity of death created bonds that transcended traditional friendship. When you hold a man in your arms while he dies, or when you take cover together beneath a shell blast, so close you feel each other's heartbeats, the line between comrade and lover blurs. This was not a war of heroes. It was a war of survivors. And survival sometimes meant rewriting the rules of love. Beyond the same-sex relationships, there was also the shadow economy of wartime prostitution, which grew into an organized machine, fueled by military necessity. In cities like Paris and Amiens, entire red light districts were sanctioned and regulated by governments desperate to prevent the spread of venereal disease, but equally desperate to maintain troop morale. Soldiers lined up with ration tickets, not for food but for visits to the regulated maisons closes, where women wore masks of powder and rouge, selling comfort as much as flesh. Some women participated out of economic desperation, others out of patriotic duty, believing that by easing the suffering of soldiers they were serving their country. The lines between consent, coercion, and survival blurred for everyone involved. Brothels kept detailed ledgers, documenting visits, prices, and even medical treatments for soldiers infected with syphilis or gonorrhea. Military medics often spent as much time treating sexual infections as they did bullet wounds. There were government-issued pamphlets warning soldiers about the dangers of the other enemy, disease. Yet those warnings did little to stop the flow of men into the brothels. After months of isolation and terror in the trenches, soldiers confessed in their letters that they visited these places not just for physical release, but for a momentary illusion of normalcy. A chance to feel like men again instead of machines waiting to be killed. Yet this system left scars not just on the bodies of soldiers, but on their minds. Some men returned from the war, unable to resume sexual relations with their wives, haunted by memories of wartime liaisons that no amount of domestic bliss could erase. The smell of perfume mingled with trench mud in their dreams. The guilt festered silently. Many veterans destroyed their letters, diaries, and photos before returning home, desperate to erase the parts of themselves that had existed only in war. But paper has a strange way of surviving, and historians today are uncovering more of these forbidden records in attic boxes, estate sales, and forgotten archives. There were also stories of soldiers falling in love with local women and promising to marry them after the war, only to vanish back to their countries once the armistice was signed. These abandoned women, some left pregnant, were the war's forgotten casualties. In France, they were called les fiancées du front, the fiancées of the front women who waited for letters that never came. Some raised children alone, inventing stories about the fathers who never returned, while others quietly disappeared from their villages, moving to cities where no one knew their shame. The military hierarchy sometimes participated in these deceptions. Officers arranged for certain women to be relocated or silenced to avoid scandal. There are documented cases of payouts made to mistresses of high-ranking officers, hush money wrapped in letters of false condolences. These cover-ups were not just about protecting reputations, but about maintaining the fragile illusion of military honor. If the public had known how soldiers survived emotionally in the trenches, how love and sex were traded like rations, it might have shattered the romantic myth of noble warfare that governments depended on to fuel enlistment. But perhaps the most heartbreaking stories come from the letters never sent, the diaries buried or burned. Soldiers wrote confessions to the women they loved, to the men they loved, to themselves. Some wrote letters intended for no one, pouring out fears and desires they could not voice aloud. In these writings, you see the raw human cost of war, not just in lives lost, but in the emotional and sexual fractures that never fully healed. A German soldier, Karl Meissner, wrote in his notebook, "I have touched more men in love than in battle." He died at Verdun, his notebook found in his pocket, stained with blood but legible enough for historians to read a century later. Similar artifacts exist in British, French, and American archives, often misfiled or hidden to avoid public scandal. Some museum curators privately admit they have collections of erotic wartime materials locked away in storage rooms, considered too controversial for public display. The official version of war prefers clean lines: courage, sacrifice, brotherhood. But the real version is messier. It involves love letters between soldiers, whispered confessions in the dark, bodies pressed together not just in death, but in life, seeking warmth and meaning. It involves women both cherished and discarded, pregnancies hidden or erased, and the complex web of human connection that does not stop when the first shell explodes. These are not comfortable stories, but they are real. They remind us that, in the worst circumstances, people reach for each other. Sometimes they do it in desperation, sometimes in love, sometimes in betrayal, but always in the attempt to feel human again. The trenches were not just killing fields. They were crucibles of emotion, where men and women, bound by circumstance, rewrote the rules of love and survival. In the next chapter, the story continues, diving deeper into the letters that reveal betrayals between friends, secret pacts of silence, and the hidden economy of sex that thrived beneath the mud and the metals. The war was not fought only with bullets. It was fought with hearts that broke and healed in ways history still struggles to confess. The deeper you descend into the realities of trench warfare, the clearer it becomes that the First World War was not merely a conflict of nations, but a war within the human soul, a slow corrosion of social norms, personal identities, and private lives. The trenches became places where soldiers, trapped between survival and annihilation, redefined morality in ways that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. When soldiers wrote home, they often filtered their experiences, sending sanitized letters to their families and wives, masking the grim reality of their days and especially their nights. But in the private pages of diaries, and in the letters never sent, a much darker, more intimate story unfolded, one of emotional dependencies, sexual favors traded for protection, friendships complicated by desire, and the secret economy of touch that existed alongside the official war effort. Among the British troops stationed near Passchendaele, there was a phrase whispered among the men: trench currency. It referred not to francs or shillings, but to acts of kindness, moments of connection, and in some cases, sexual favors that were exchanged in the muddy barter system of survival. When the human body becomes another form of ration, every interaction carries layers of unspoken negotiation. Young privates, barely out of adolescence, sometimes found themselves in situations where compliance meant safety and refusal meant ostracism or worse. Some did so willingly, craving intimacy after months of brutal isolation. Others were coerced, trapped in power dynamics they couldn't escape. There were no official rules for this shadow economy, but everyone understood the cost. An extra ration of rum could be traded for a few hours of warmth in a senior officer's dugout. Carrying an officer's pack might lead to special privileges, a softer blanket, or the promise of a safer post during the next advance. For some, this became a way of life, a means of survival that blurred the lines between companionship and exploitation. In the French trenches, similar systems existed. Letters uncovered from French archives describe young soldiers, known as les petits, who attached themselves to older, higher-ranking men for protection and favor. Some of these relationships were tender, even loving. Others were cold transactions, understood by both parties as temporary contracts designed to endure the war. In the diaries of Sergeant Marcel Duval, a 26-year-old from Lyon, he wrote about his arrangement with Private Rain, a 17-year-old conscript who had no family and no connections in the army. Duval provided him with better rations, helped him avoid the most dangerous assignments, and in return, rain warmed his bed at night. Duval wrote, "It is not love as I knew it before the war. It is something else, a contract of bodies, a shared breath in the cold. Perhaps when this is over, I will forget his face. Or perhaps I will remember him more than any battlefield." This was not an anomaly. Across the Western Front, soldiers formed such attachments, blending necessity with human need, creating makeshift families in the mud. But the war did not only rewrite the rules for the soldiers in the trenches. It affected those back home as well. Letters from wives reveal parallel stories of longing, betrayal, and secret liaisons. With husbands gone for years, some women sought comfort elsewhere, entering into relationships with men who remained behind conscientious objectors, injured veterans, or men exempt from service. There were cases of soldiers returning from the front to find their wives pregnant by other men, leading to quiet divorces, public scandals, or in some cases, violent confrontations. The war created a moral vacuum, and both men and women filled it in the ways they knew how. Yet for soldiers, the guilt of their own actions compounded with the betrayal they perceived from home. Diaries are filled with confessions of confusion and despair, men who believed they were sacrificing everything for their families, only to discover their absence had created spaces for other men to enter. Some responded with acceptance, understanding the desperation on both sides. Others fell into bitterness, their letters turning cold, mechanical, devoid of affection. There was Private Samuel Hargreaves, who after learning of his wife's affair back home, stopped writing to her altogether. In his diary, he wrote, "She has another now, so I shall have another here. We are all unfaithful, each in our own way." Samuel's subsequent entries detail his relationship with a nurse he met during a brief hospital stay after being wounded by shrapnel. He described her as his war wife, a term used by many soldiers to describe temporary companions who provided emotional and physical support during the war years. These relationships were often understood to be temporary, but that did not make them less intense. For some soldiers, the bonds they formed during the war felt more real than the marriages left behind in civilian life. In moments of crisis, the person who holds your hand while you bleed feels closer than the person who writes from across an ocean. The war created a hierarchy of intimacy, one based not on years of shared life, but on immediate survival and proximity. This led to complicated emotions when the war ended. Soldiers who had pledged themselves to lovers in the trenches, or in the villages of France and Belgium, often abandoned those promises when they returned home. Some could not reconcile the two. Halves of their lives, the man they had been in war, and the man they were expected to be in peace. There are documented cases of soldiers returning to their hometowns, resuming their marriages, and yet secretly writing letters to their wartime lovers for years afterward, hiding these correspondences in attic boxes or burying them under floorboards. Some of these letters have surfaced in estate sales or during renovations, revealing a hidden layer of personal history that families often found shocking. Sons and daughters discovered that their fathers had entire secret lives formed in the muddy crucible of war. The psychological consequences of these double lives were profound. Many veterans suffered from what was then called neurasthenia, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. But it was not just the trauma of combat that haunted them. It was the emotional and sexual dislocation they experienced. The roles they had to play to survive in the trenches did not easily translate back into civilian life. Some men could not sleep beside their wives without flinching, their bodies conditioned to expect danger or betrayal even in intimacy. Others found themselves emotionally numb, unable to reconnect with their pre-war selves. In therapy sessions, years later, some veterans confessed to their doctors not about killing the enemy, but about the relationships they had formed during the war. Relationships that they could neither forget nor publicly acknowledge. This emotional secrecy became a form of private warfare, a lifelong battle against memory and shame. Meanwhile, for the women who had relationships with soldiers during the war, especially those in occupied territories or near the front lines, the end of the war often meant social ruin. In France and Belgium, women accused of fraternizing with the enemy or with foreign soldiers were publicly humiliated. Some had their heads shaved in village squares. Others were exiled from their communities. The children born from these wartime relationships carried the stigma for decades, labeled as war babies or children of shame. Some never knew their fathers' names. Others were told false stories about their origins, fabrications designed to protect family honor. The legacy of these relationships did not end in 1918. It rippled through generations. The war tore apart the fabric of traditional relationships and replaced it with a tapestry of secrets, half-truths, and emotional wounds that never fully healed. In private memoirs and unpublished manuscripts, veterans admitted that the war's most lasting impact was not physical, but emotional, the love they lost, the love they found, and the love they were forced to deny. These stories remain largely absent from mainstream history books, hidden behind the sanitized narratives of heroism and sacrifice. But they exist, whispered in letters, scribbled in diaries, buried in family archives. They remind us that in the darkest moments, human beings reach for connection, even when that connection defies the rules they once lived by. The trenches were not just battlefields. They were places where the boundaries of love, sex, and loyalty were redrawn in mud and blood. And for many, those boundaries never return to what they were before. The further one unravels the tangled lives of World War I soldiers, the clearer it becomes that the war did not just rupture national borders, it dismantled the private borders of love, sex, and identity. Behind every uniform was a man whose inner world was collapsing just as violently as the trenches outside. The artillery could destroy a man's body, but loneliness hollowed out his spirit, leaving him vulnerable to emotional entanglements that in another time and place might have been unthinkable. The psychological breakdown of war turned rigid, moral codes into flexible negotiations, survival-driven rewrites of personal ethics. In the muddy labyrinth of the trenches, men found themselves navigating secret relationships, forbidden desires, and emotionally complex dependencies that blurred the lines between duty and longing. Private Alfred Bennett of the British 9th Battalion kept a journal sewn into the lining of his coat. In it, he wrote of his companion in fear, a fellow soldier named Thomas, with whom he shared not only a dugout, but every raw piece of his fractured emotional state. For Bennett, the war was not just about avoiding bullets, but about managing the terror that crept in during the quiet moments between shellings. In his writings, he described the night they first crossed the boundary from friendship to something else, a moment not driven by lust, but by the unbearable need for human touch after weeks of holding death at arm's length. He wrote, "It happened without words. We held each other because there was nothing else to hold on to. In the morning, we did not speak of it, but that night was warmer than any other." Such encounters were not singular events. They repeated across the front, from the mud-slicked trenches of Flanders to the barbed wire fields of Verdun. Soldiers who survived these moments often did so because they built emotional lifeboats with each other, structures of comfort amid the chaos. But these were not relationships soldiers could easily name. They existed in a gray area, unspoken agreements wrapped in silence, because to label them was to risk disgrace or punishment. Yet in private writings, men confessed the truth of their trench experiences, not only the killing but the loving, the secret touches, the nights shared under tattered blankets when warmth meant more than propriety. The Army's official stance was clear. Homosexuality was punishable by imprisonment or discharge. But enforcement was inconsistent. Some commanding officers looked the other way, understanding that such relationships kept their men from breaking mentally. Others used accusations as weapons, threats to control behavior, or settle grudges. There were whispered stories of blackmail, where one soldier would exploit another's secret in exchange for favors or protection. This shadow economy of emotional and sexual bargaining became a second battlefield, invisible to the public, but as real as any trench raid. For some soldiers, the emotional consequences of these hidden relationships were more enduring than their physical wounds. When the war ended, they returned home to wives and families, but part of them remained in the trenches. Not just the trauma, but the connections formed in extremis. Some men tried to resume traditional lives, burying their wartime selves beneath layers of silence. Others sought out clandestine relationships in civilian life, unable to unlearn the intimacy they had discovered in war. Some suffered in isolation, haunted by memories of nights they could not forget, but could never speak of aloud. The betrayal of conventional marriage vows during the war was not limited to soldiers. Women on the home front also lived in emotional and moral limbo. With husbands gone for years, some wives formed relationships with other men, sometimes out of need, sometimes out of loneliness, sometimes because they believed their husbands would never return. When soldiers came back, they often found that home was not the same place they had left. Families had reshaped themselves in their absence. Children had grown. Wives had changed. And the emotional distance between wartime experiences and domestic life became a chasm many veterans could not cross. This dissonance led to quiet divorces, secret resentments, and lives lived in parallel, where the husband and wife slept in the same bed but existed in different emotional worlds. For those who fathered children with women in occupied territories or near the front, the post-war years were filled with ghost-like presences, the knowledge of sons and daughters left behind in France, Belgium, or even Germany, children who bore their blood but would never know their names. Some of these children were raised in silence, their mothers inventing stories to explain absent fathers. Others grew up knowing they were the products of wartime liaisons, carrying the stigma of illegitimacy in societies that valued bloodlines and legitimacy. The war scattered these personal histories across Europe like shrapnel, embedding secret wounds in families for generations. In the official military records, none of this exists. The files list names, ranks, causes of death, medals awarded. They do not record the moments when two men clung to each other in a trench, when a soldier whispered love to a woman he would never see again, when emotional survival overtook the rules of religion and law. But the private letters, the hidden diaries, and the posthumous confessions tell a different story. A history beneath the history, written in the margins and between the lines. Some veterans tried to destroy these records, burning letters in fireplaces or burying notebooks in backyards. But paper has a strange way of surviving. Decades later, family members found bundles of correspondence tied with string, revealing the private wars their fathers and grandfathers had fought long after the guns went silent. In rare cases, these stories emerged publicly. Memoirs written in old age by dying veterans sometimes included passages of shocking honesty, admissions of relationships that defied the norms of their time. One such memoir, privately published in 1964 by a Canadian soldier named Harold M., described in detail his love affair with another soldier named Peter. During the winter of 1917, Harold wrote, "We shared everything: the cold, the fear, the lice, and our bodies. In the trenches, there was no room for pretense, only survival." His family suppressed the book, printing only a few copies, but one survived, eventually finding its way into a university archive. In modern times, historians have begun to piece together these fragments, creating a more complete portrait of what life was like for soldiers beyond the battlefield reports. The emotional economies of World War I were as complex and dangerous as the military strategies. Love, sex, betrayal, and longing operated in secret, but they were as vital to survival as any ration of bread or water. In French military hospitals, doctors treated not just wounds, but venereal diseases, quietly aware that some infections came not from brothels, but from fellow soldiers. Chaplains heard confessions they could not repeat, priests absolving sins they barely understood. In German regiments, there are reports of similar dynamics, relationships between soldiers that were tolerated unofficially because they kept morale from collapsing completely. The enemy was not just the soldier across the wire. It was loneliness, and men fought it however they could. Some men found solace in letters from home, clinging to memories of wives and sweethearts. Others found solace in the arms of those beside them, building temporary families in the mud and rain. The war did not allow for purity. It demanded compromise, adaptation, and sometimes the abandonment of previous moral frameworks. For soldiers, the question was not how to remain faithful to peacetime values, but how to remain human in inhuman conditions. The choices they made, choices of love, of touch, of betrayal, were not always noble, but they were real. And they are part of the story of World War I that deserves to be told, not as scandal, but as truth. The emotional history of the trenches is as essential as the military history. It explains why some men survived and others did not. It explains the nightmares, the suicides, the silences that followed them home. In the next chapter, we will continue to follow these threads, exploring the secret promises made in whispered conversations, the pacts of silence that endured for decades, and the ways in which the war redefined not only national borders, but the very fabric of personal identity. Because when you look closely enough, you see that the war did not end in 1989 for the hearts of the men who lived it not, as the war dragged into its third and fourth years. Trench life evolved into something even more complex and emotionally volatile, a theater of survival where men became actors in roles they never imagined before enlistment. War literature often speaks of camaraderie, of shared rations and brotherhood forged in fire. But beneath that sanitized narrative lies a far more intimate, tangled reality, a system of private agreements, secret alliances, and emotional dependencies that both saved and scarred the soldiers involved. For the men in the trenches, especially those stationed in the remote outposts along the Somme or the Argonne, the war became not just a military campaign, but an alternate existence where new rules governed behavior. Among these soldiers, a phenomenon developed that has rarely been discussed openly in history books, but is now evident through uncovered diaries and unsent letters. The creation of private pacts, emotional and physical contracts, made between men who knew they might die at any moment. These pacts were promises to keep each other sane, to share everything from smuggled chocolate bars to the warmth of a body during frostbitten nights, to ensure someone would be there if shell shock took hold. Some of these arrangements became deeply romantic, others strictly survival-based, but nearly all of them involved lines being crossed, boundaries dissolved in the face of death's looming shadow. One such pact was documented in the journal of Corporal Elias Moore, who served in the British Expeditionary Forces near Ypres. He wrote about Private James Carter, a young man from Manchester, who joined the unit fresh-faced and optimistic, but soon became hollow-eyed from the horrors he witnessed. Elias and James formed an unspoken bond during their first month together, a connection that began with shared cigarettes and quiet conversation and evolved into something neither man could fully articulate. Moore described nights where they would hold each other beneath tarpaulin sheets, pressed close to avoid the cold, but also to escape the terror that clawed at their insides. In his journal, Moore wrote, "We do not speak of it by daylight, but in the dark, we are not soldiers. We are only men who do not want to die alone." These kinds of relationships were far more common than official military accounts would ever admit. They were not always sexual, but when they became so, it was. Often with an undercurrent of desperation rather than simple desire. In the endless cold and trauma of trench warfare, the body became both a weapon and a refuge, a place to hide from the collapse of sanity. Some soldiers took solace in the flesh of others because it was the only thing still alive, still warm, when the world around them had frozen into death. In French trenches, similar dynamics played out under different cultural codes. French soldiers referred to these silent agreements as les pacts de nuit, the pacts of the night. These were often made between older soldiers and the younger, less experienced conscripts who leaned on their seniors not just for military guidance, but for emotional survival. In return for mentorship, protection, and occasional leniency in assignments, younger soldiers would sometimes offer companionship in forms that transcended friendship. French military psychologists later found notes in their wartime case studies referencing effective arrangements among soldiers, though these reports were buried deep in medical archives and not included in official histories. In German trenches, the phenomenon also existed, but carried even more severe risks. German military law under the Kaiserreich was notoriously strict about sexual conduct among soldiers. Yet letters intercepted by military censors revealed a network of secret liaisons. Some men used coded language to describe their bonds, referring to their closest companions as "mein ander Hälfte," my other half. Punishments for discovery could include imprisonment or execution, though many officers ignored such situations unless they threatened unit discipline. The reality was that officers knew what kept their men stable, and sometimes stability came at the cost of moral orthodoxy. Alongside these same-sex pacts, there were also transactional relationships between soldiers and civilians, particularly in occupied zones. Local women, many of them widows or destitute due to the war's destruction of the economy, engaged in quiet arrangements with soldiers, exchanging companionship and sometimes sexual favors for food, medicine, or protection from other troops. These relationships were complicated by the politics of occupation, and many women paid dearly for them after the war ended, accused of collaboration and publicly humiliated. Some had their heads shaved in village squares. Others were exiled from their communities. But during the war itself, these women were often lifelines for soldiers desperate for moments of normalcy. They provided not just physical relief, but also emotional connection, sitting with soldiers, listening to their stories, humanizing them in a way that military life no longer allowed. In one case documented by a French field chaplain, a Belgian woman named Marie provided nightly shelter to a small group of soldiers in exchange for bread and tobacco. Over time, the arrangement evolved into something more intimate, a strange makeshift family that lasted until the unit rotated out. The soldiers wrote of her in their letters as a saint, though they also admitted their interactions with her went beyond simple charity. For the soldiers involved, these moments were not about betrayal of their wives or lovers back home, but about survival of the soul. In the trenches, morality did not operate in black and white. It was colored by mud, blood, and the need to endure the unbearable. Emotional survival took precedence over social convention. Some men wrote to their wives in cryptic terms, hinting at connections formed in the trenches without fully confessing their nature. Others stayed silent, knowing that the war's emotional debris could never be fully explained to those who had not lived through it. Chaplains heard confessions that blurred the line between sin and necessity. One British chaplain, Reverend Charles Ellis, kept a secret diary where he recorded the private conversations he had with soldiers. In it, He wrote of men confessing not only fear and despair, but love shared with fellow soldiers, moments of weakness that had become moments of comfort. Ellis, bound by the code of confidentiality, absolved these men quietly, often offering words of compassion rather than condemnation. He recognized that the trenches were a moral no man's land, where the usual rules had crumbled under the weight of constant death. After the war, many of these men carried their secrets home. Some married, started families, and never spoke of their wartime experiences beyond the sanitized versions told at veterans' reunions or family dinners. Others found themselves haunted by memories of the pacts they had made, the promises to meet again after the war, the whispered plans to start new lives together, the quiet acknowledgments that they had become something more than friends under the shadow of war. For some, these pacts ended abruptly with death. Letters from one soldier to another were returned unopened, marked killed in action. There were no official channels to mourn these losses as lovers. Grief had to be channeled through the lens of camaraderie, masked beneath platitudes about fallen comrades. Some men carried photographs of their trench partners in their pockets until they died decades later, buried with the images of people they could never publicly name as partners. The legacy of these wartime relationships remains hidden in many ways, obscured by the dominant narratives of military history. Museums display weapons, uniforms, medals, but rarely do they tell the stories of human connection that kept soldiers alive when bullets did not find them. Yet these connections were real, and they shaped the emotional landscapes of the post-war world. The men who returned home often did so as altered beings, carrying not just the trauma of combat, but the secret histories of love and need, forged in impossible circumstances. Some became advocates for greater understanding of human psychology, though they rarely revealed the personal reasons for their interest. Others withdrew from social life altogether, unable to reconcile their wartime selves with the roles expected of them in peacetime. The war did not just change borders. It changed hearts. In the next chapter, we will explore how these wartime relationships influenced post-war culture in subtle but profound ways, from literature to silent understandings among veterans, and how the emotional economies of World War I laid the groundwork for social shifts that historians are only now beginning to fully uncover. When the guns finally fell silent in November of 1918, the world rejoiced, but for many soldiers, the end of the First World War did not signal the end of their personal battles. The trenches had not only carved physical scars into their bodies, but had rewritten their emotional DNA, leaving them with secret histories they could not share in public or even with their closest family members. Men returned home to parades, medals pinned on their chests, families embracing them at train stations. But beneath the smiles were fractured souls who carried within them the weight of trench pacts, wartime affairs, and emotional contracts made in the mud. Many of these veterans tried to reintegrate into civilian life, slipping back into marriages, resuming jobs, attending church services. But something inside had shifted irreversibly. The emotional intimacy they had found in the trenches, whether with fellow soldiers or local women in occupied towns, had created bonds that could not simply be erased by a return to normalcy. The emotional landscapes of these men were crowded with ghosts, not just of the dead, but of the living relationships they left behind. In letters never sent and diaries never published, veterans confessed that they missed not only the adrenaline of combat, but the closeness of trench life, the shared cigarettes, the whispered conversations in dugouts, and the bodies pressed together for warmth. These were not just memories of camaraderie. They were recollections of need, of the fragile moments when survival meant surrendering to human connection in its rawest forms. Some veterans found themselves unable to resume sexual relations with their wives, their bodies conditioned to different rhythms, different partners, or burdened with guilt and confusion about what had happened. During the war, others carried the shame of affairs that had started in village brothels or in makeshift huts where locals and soldiers negotiated complex exchanges of comfort. The official histories ignored these private negotiations, but personal writings reveal a vast undercurrent of sexual and emotional survival tactics. One French soldier, Étienne Leclerc, wrote in his private journal found years later in an attic in Rouen that he returned to his wife but could no longer look her in the eye during intimacy because his mind drifted back to the farm girl. In Reims, who had saved him from a night of despair after a bombardment left half his eunuch dead, he wrote, "I closed my eyes and saw her face, not my wife's. I wished to confess, but dared not." In Britain, similar accounts surfaced in the margins of veterans' memoirs, often couched in euphemism. Some spoke of special friendships formed during the war, bonds that could not be explained in peacetime terms. In interviews conducted by early 20th century psychologists studying shell shock, patients occasionally admitted that the most troubling memories were not of battle, but of the intimate moments they experienced in the trenches, moments that now haunted them because they had no place in civilian life. The emotional survival strategies of war had left these men carrying dual lives, public faces of stoic veterans, private landscapes of complicated longing and unresolved attachments. For some, the only way to cope was through silence. They became men of few words, retreating into their own minds, their families assuming it was the trauma of combat alone that kept them distant. But for many, it was also the trauma of love, of secret relationships that had no future, of promises made under the rain of artillery that could never be kept in the light of day. In Germany, returning soldiers faced even harsher scrutiny. The rigid moral codes of the post-war period left no room for confession. Homosexuality remained criminalized, and the soldiers who had found solace in each other's arms during the war now faced lives of concealment, knowing that discovery could mean ruin. Some emigrated, moving to places where the social codes were less strict, though they still carried the burden of their memories. A few wrote letters to their trench companions, but most received no reply. Some of those letters were intercepted. Some the recipients had died. Others simply chose to sever all ties with the past. In rare cases, these letters have survived, passed down through families who did not understand their significance until scholars unearthed them decades later. One such letter, found in the estate of a German soldier named Friedrich Weber, read simply, "I miss your hand in mine more than I miss the uniform." It was never sent, tucked into the back of an old photo album, discovered only when Weber's grandchildren sold his belongings at an estate auction. In France, some of the women who had engaged in relationships with soldiers found themselves socially punished after the war, particularly if they had consorted with enemy soldiers or with multiple partners from different nationalities. They were labeled as femmes tendues, the shaven women publicly humiliated, their heads shaved in acts of social vengeance. But even those who had loved Allied soldiers often found themselves abandoned, left to raise children alone, forced to create new lives without the men who had once promised to return for them. The war had turned love into a transaction, and in peacetime, the debts went unpaid. For the soldiers who had formed pacts of silence, keeping the trench world separate from the civilian world became a lifelong commitment. At reunions, they toasted to the fallen, spoke of battlefield victories, but rarely mentioned the private moments that had kept them alive when they thought they could not endure another day. A hand on a shoulder, a shared cot, a whispered promise in the dark. These were the real stories, but they were too heavy for public discourse. In post-war literature, traces of these emotional undercurrents appeared in subtle forms. The war. Poets, men like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, hinted at these themes in lines about comradeship and closeness, though never explicitly enough to spark scandal. Scholars now read these works with new eyes, recognizing the coded language of intimacy that threaded through their verse. In the years after the war, some veterans found solace in art and writing, using fiction to process their experiences. Others turned to alcohol, drowning memories they could not speak aloud. A few committed suicide, leaving behind notes that mentioned neither the battlefield nor the enemy, but the personal losses they could not resolve. There were even veterans who reconnected years later, meeting in secret, rekindling wartime bonds in quiet corners of Europe far from prying eyes. These meetings were not always about physical love. Sometimes they were simply about holding space for memories that no one else could understand. The camaraderie of war had a shadow side, a side that included longing, touch, and emotional dependence that blurred the lines of sexuality, friendship, and survival. The war had forced men into roles they never imagined, and some discovered parts of themselves they could not abandon even after the guns went quiet. For those who returned to wives and families, the divide between the trench self and the home self became an invisible wound, one that festered beneath the surface for decades. Some wrote letters they never sent, confessions they burned before. Anyone could read them, yet the words remained etched in their minds, sentences they could not unwrite. The physical injuries of war healed with time. The emotional ones often did not. In the next chapter, we will examine how these hidden histories influenced post-war relationships, how veterans navigated marriage and fatherhood while carrying secret desires and unresolved grief, and how the emotional economy of World War I left ripples that can still be traced in the personal letters and diaries, hidden away in forgotten trunks and dusty attics across the world. After the war ended, and the world shifted into uneasy peace, soldiers carried with them more than just memories of mud, death, and survival. They carried secret wounds of the heart, hidden from the public but etched into private letters and diaries that rarely saw daylight. The return to civilian life was supposed to be a homecoming, but for many veterans, it was like stepping into a foreign land where their pre-war selves no longer existed. They were expected to pick up where they had left off, husbands returning to wives, fathers to children, sons to aging parents. But the men who had endured the trenches had become something else, molded not only by violence, but by the secret emotional lives they had lived behind the front lines. In drawing rooms and dinner tables across Europe, men sat silently, eating meals with families who had no idea of the complex web of love, betrayal, and survival they had woven during the war years. The official version of their service was clean and honorable. The private reality was messier, filled with relationships they could not speak of, with men and women they had held close during their most vulnerable moments, only to abandon or lose in the chaos of demobilization. Some soldiers tried to write it all down, to make sense of the dual lives they had lived, the life of uniform and orders, and the life of whispered promises and shared cots. But most of those writings ended up burned, buried, or locked away in boxes no one was meant to find. Yet some of these confessions survived, and now they reveal a hidden layer of the post-war experience that history books often omit. Among the most telling documents are letters between soldiers who, after returning home, continued to correspond in secret, using coded language to maintain emotional connections forged in the trenches. These letters reveal an ongoing struggle to reconcile wartime intimacy with peacetime expectations. One set of letters, exchanged between two British veterans, Edward and Thomas, details their clandestine meetings in London parks, always under the shadow of societal scrutiny. Edward wrote, "We shake hands longer than necessary because we cannot do more. We speak of the war because that is the only safe language we share. Though what I really mean is, I miss you." Thomas replied, "I walk the city with you in my thoughts, still tasting the earth of France in my mouth, still feeling the nights when we lay side by side and pretended it was for warmth. Their letters spanned 3 years after the war, filled with longing and the constant fear of exposure. Such correspondences were not rare. In Germany, similar relationships continued under even harsher conditions. The post-war years were fraught with political and social upheaval, and any hint of nonconformity was dangerous. Yet former soldiers wrote to each other in coded phrases, sometimes using poetry or religious references as disguises for affection. One letter from a German soldier named Lucas to his wartime companion reads, "When I light the candle at night, it is not for God, but for you." These men were not attempting to defy society. They were simply trying to survive emotionally, trapped between the lives they were expected to lead and the lives they had secretly lived. For those who had formed relationships with women during the war, French villagers, Belgian nurses, German widows, the aftermath was equally complicated. Some soldiers sent money in secret, supporting children they had fathered abroad, while others cut all ties, unable to face the complexity of their choices. Women left behind in occupied territories often bore the brunt of this emotional abandonment, raising children alone, sometimes fabricating stories to explain absent fathers, sometimes carrying lifelong bitterness. In some cases, post-war marriages were haunted by these wartime liaisons. Wives sensed the distance in their husbands, the part of them that had remained in France or Belgium, emotionally entangled with someone else. Some marriages survived on silence, couples agreeing without words to avoid the subject of the war's personal consequences. Others collapsed under the weight of unspoken betrayals. There were also soldiers who attempted to confess. Diaries tell of men who sat down with their wives to reveal the truth, only to be met with confusion, anger, or quiet acceptance colored by mutual exhaustion. One British veteran wrote in his journal, "I told her everything. She said she understood, but we never spoke of it again. We sleep back to back now, and the bed is colder than the trench ever was." For others, the confessional urge was too dangerous. They carried their secrets to the grave, leaving behind coded letters or half-burned notebooks that future generations would puzzle over. Some of these artifacts surfaced in estate sales, others in archives where curators quietly filed them away, unsure of how to present these narratives to the public. In academic circles, historians began to notice patterns in veteran writings. Phrases like, "the friend I cannot name," "the bond that saved me," "the nights we shared when the world ended." These were not just metaphors for camaraderie. They were literal accounts of emotional and physical relationships that transcended friendship and defied the rigid structures of early 20th century society. The war had created a space where such bonds were possible, even necessary, but peacetime closed that space abruptly, leaving many veterans emotionally stranded. For those who fathered children abroad, the situation was often more visible, but no less complicated. Some acknowledged these children quietly, sending money through intermediaries. Others ignored them entirely, leaving women to face the social stigma alone. In France and Belgium, war orphans became a silent population, growing up with half-truths about their origins. Some mothers told their children that their fathers had died heroically. Others said nothing at all, letting the silence speak for itself. A few children, as adults, discovered their parentage through old letters or photographs, finding faces in faded images that resembled their own. These revelations often led to more questions than answers. In families with a soldier's home, life continued. The existence of another family abroad became an unspoken threat to the fragile peace of post-war domesticity. Some wives knew, but chose silence, preferring not to disrupt the return to normal life, while others lived in fear of discovery, wondering if one day a letter would arrive exposing the hidden chapters of their husbands' lives. Emotional survival. After the war became an exercise in compartmentalization, Men who had learned to love in the trenches, whether with other soldiers or with women far from home, had to suppress those experiences or risk social and familial ruin. Some turned to religious confession, seeking absolution they did not truly believe in, while others submerged themselves in work, trying to drown the past in routine. A few found solace in writing, crafting poems or novels under pseudonyms, channeling their stories into fiction that masked reality. Literary scholars have since identified this trend, tracing themes of forbidden love and lost comradeship in post-war literature that at first seemed innocuous but now reads as coded autobiography. Yet for the majority, the trench romances and pacts remained locked away in memory. Some veterans never married, citing shell shock or physical injury as reasons, when in truth they could not reconcile their wartime selves with the role society demanded. Others married, but lived emotionally distant lives, unable to explain the parts of themselves that had been permanently altered by the war. In veteran communities, there was often a silent understanding. Men who had shared the front lines recognized in each other the signs of unspoken histories. Reunions became places where coded glances and half-sentences conveyed more than speeches or medals ever could. They toasted the fallen, but rarely spoke of the lovers they had lost, whether those lovers had died in battle or been left behind when the war ended. The grief was private, the mourning silent, the emotional casualties unrecorded. In the years that followed, wars continued, but the specific dynamics of World War I, the trench life, the prolonged isolation, the enforced intimacy of men sharing life and death in such close quarters, created a unique set of emotional experiences. These were not replicated in the same way in later conflicts, though echoes of them appear in letters from World War II and beyond. What World War I left behind was a legacy of hidden love, of silent connections that history still struggles to acknowledge fully. Today, historians comb through archives, piecing together these narratives from fragments, from letters that begin with "My dearest" and never specify a name, from diaries that mention "the one who kept me alive" without explanation. These documents are finally being read not just as curiosities, but as essential parts of the war's history, shedding light on the human need for connection that transcends battlefield rhetoric. In the next chapter, we will explore how these hidden relationships influenced the veterans' post-war identities, how some found ways to express their secret lives in art, music, and literature, and how others lived quietly, carrying memories that never found a public voice, but remained vivid in private moments, whispered only to themselves as they drifted to sleep, long after the war had officially ended. As the years passed and the dust of World War I settled into history books, monuments, and government ceremonies, the private stories of the soldiers who lived through the trenches became quieter, buried beneath layers of social expectation, silence, and denial. Society wanted heroes, not human beings with messy emotions, conflicted desires, and secret lives shaped by war's peculiar intimacy. The soldiers, for the most part, complied with this narrative because there was little choice. To speak of the bonds they had formed, whether with fellow soldiers under the rain-soaked tarpaulins of the Western Front or with women in candlelit village rooms, was to risk social exile, ridicule, or worse. So they carried their stories in silence. But silence does not mean absence. The emotional weight of those years lived on in private moments, in restless sleep, in the trembling of hands when familiar smells or sounds triggered memories of nights spent entangled not only with fear of death, but with another body pressed close, another voice murmuring comfort in the dark. In the interwar period, these unresolved experiences influenced everything from marriage dynamics to artistic expression. Some veterans turned to painting or sculpture, channeling their memories into abstract forms, hoping that color and texture could hold what words could not. Others wrote under pseudonyms, crafting fictionalized accounts of trench life that, for those who knew how to read between the lines, revealed the deeper truth of emotional and sexual survival in the war. In certain rare cases, men found ways to continue the connections they had formed during the conflict, maintaining secret correspondences or arranging quiet meetings in cities where anonymity was easier to find. In Paris, for example, cafes became havens for veterans who recognized each other not just by medals on their chests, but by the unspoken language of shared experience. A glance across a room could carry volumes. A nod could acknowledge years of unsaid longing. A handshake held for a second too long could resurrect the ghosts of trench nights when human touch had been a scarce and precious commodity. In London, some veterans frequented parks known for covert meetings, not necessarily out of a desire for new connections, but to feel close again to the moments that had kept them alive when the world was collapsing around them. For many, the physical intimacy of war had been less about sex and more about proximity, about not facing death alone. But the body remembers what it has been taught, and some men found themselves unable to separate emotional need from physical contact, haunted by the loss of closeness in peacetime routines that now felt empty and artificial. Marriage after the war was complicated by these unseen scars. Wives noticed the distance in their husbands, but rarely understood its cause. Some men became emotionally numb, incapable of the kind of romantic affection expected of them, because their primary emotional attachments had been formed in contexts that could never be replicated at home. Others tried to bridge the gap, only to find that the language of love they had learned in the trenches, rooted in survival, whispered promises, and physical closeness under fire did not translate into peacetime courtship. There were cases of men who confessed to their wives, revealing aspects of their trench relationships in halting, shame-laden conversations, but most chose silence, preferring to live with the internal contradiction rather than risk the collapse of their domestic lives. Diaries from this period often contain cryptic entries. Saw him today, but we said nothing, or she asked me why I'm cold. I cannot explain without burning the whole house down. These fragments speak to the inner wars still raging long after the armistice. Some veterans found relief in art movements that embraced the chaotic and the surreal. The Dadaists and early modernist writers, many of whom were veterans themselves, infused their works with the themes of broken identity, fragmented memory, and emotional dislocation. Underneath the avant-garde aesthetics lay the hidden pulse of wartime intimacy, the memories of nights spent in the company of someone who knew the same fear, the same hunger, the same desperate need to feel human in a world that had become mechanical and violent. In the rural countryside, far from the intellectual circles of Paris and Berlin, veterans coped in other ways. Some withdrew into isolation, becoming farmers, fishermen, or laborers who spoke little, who drank heavily, who avoided the closeness of others because it threatened to crack the fragile shell they had constructed to survive post-war life. Others joined veterans' associations, where rituals of remembrance allowed them to acknowledge each other's scars without ever naming them. These associations became a form of silent therapy, a place where the boundaries of official history could be stretched to accommodate unspoken truths. Yet, for all these coping mechanisms, there were countless men who simply lived with the burden of their wartime loves locked inside, memories they carried to the grave. In rare moments, when illness or old age stripped away the filters of social caution, some confessions emerged. A dying veteran might whisper to a nurse about a man he loved in the trenches, or about a village woman he never forgot, knowing that his words would likely vanish into the air with his last breath. Some families discovered letters among their deceased relatives' belongings, letters never sent, addressed to men or women whose names no one recognized, written in tones of longing and grief that suggested something far deeper than friendship. For these families, the discoveries were often shocking, reshaping their understanding of the person they thought they knew. The children of veterans sometimes struggled with these revelations, trying to reconcile the stoic father figure they remembered with the emotionally complex man revealed in ink and paper decades later. Some chose to ignore the implications, folding the letters back into their envelopes and returning them to drawers. Others donated them to archives, allowing historians to piece together the hidden mosaic of wartime emotional life. As historians began to take these personal documents seriously, a new narrative of World War I emerged, one that did not diminish the heroism or sacrifice of the soldiers, but added layers of human complexity to their stories. It became clear that the trenches were not just sites of physical endurance, but spaces where the boundaries of love, friendship, and desire collapsed under the weight of survival. The human need for connection did not disappear in war. It adapted, found new forms, and persisted even when bullets were flying and death was near. Soldiers reached for each other in ways that defied the conventions of their time, and when the war ended, they carried those connections, whether in their hearts, in letters, or in silence, into a world that was not ready to hear them. In contemporary times, scholars and writers have started to explore these aspects of war history more openly. Novels and films now occasionally depict the emotional lives of soldiers with greater honesty, acknowledging the spectrum of human relationships that arise in extreme conditions. Memoirs discovered in attics or passed down through families are being published, adding nuance to the historical record. Museums are slowly beginning to curate exhibits that include not just weapons and uniforms, but letters and personal artifacts that speak to the emotional survival strategies of soldiers. These efforts are not about scandalizing history, but about humanizing it, about recognizing that war is not only about strategy and sacrifice, but about the fragile, beautiful, and sometimes forbidden ways people cling to each other when the world falls apart. In the next chapter, we will explore how these hidden stories influenced post-war generations, how the children and grandchildren of soldiers inherited not only medals and photographs, but the echoes of love letters never sent, the shadows of secrets carried across decades, and the complicated legacy of a war that changed not only geopolitics, but the deepest corners of the human heart. As the war veterans aged into the quiet, gray decades of the 1920s and 1930s, many of them carried with them the silent burden of unresolved love, clandestine affairs, and trench-forged intimacy that no government medal or commemorative plaque could acknowledge. The official histories continued to focus on strategy, valor, and sacrifice, but beneath the surface of ceremonies and memorials, a parallel history simmered, a history of emotional survival, of bodies and hearts shared in secret, of promises whispered over the dying gasps of trench life and never fully released. For the post-war generation, the consequences of these hidden histories filtered down in subtle but powerful ways. Children born from wartime affairs grew up with gaps in their personal narratives, sometimes suspecting the truth but unable to prove it. Sons and daughters of soldiers wondered why their fathers would fall silent during certain conversations, why they flinched at touch, why they grew cold when pressed about the war years. Some of these children later uncovered letters or photographs tucked into drawers or attic boxes, images of unfamiliar faces, men in uniforms leaning too closely together, women whose names were never spoken at home, but whose letters were kept in private collections, folded carefully, preserved like forbidden relics. For the women left behind during the war, the post-war years were often defined by emotional confusion. Wives knew their husbands had returned as different men, but many could not articulate why. Some noticed the way their husbands drifted into silence when they read newspaper reports about the war, or how their eyes lingered on old photographs longer than necessary. In a few rare cases, women confronted their husbands directly, asking about the things they could sense but not confirm. Some of these confrontations led to partial confessions, half-truths designed to placate, to keep domestic life intact while skirting the full reality of what had transpired in the trenches. Other men denied everything, locking the secrets deeper. Inside, choosing the slow erosion of emotional distance over the catastrophic fallout of revelation. For many veterans, the war had taught them to compartmentalize pain, to bury feelings beneath layers of discipline and routine. But trauma has a way of seeping through cracks, and so did love, especially love that had no sanctioned place in society. Some veterans found covert ways to maintain emotional connections with their wartime companions. They joined letter-writing circles, ostensibly to stay in touch with former comrades. But within these exchanges, subtle codes existed, phrases and references that meant more to the intended reader than to any potential censor. In rare cases, these correspondences included photographs of meetings at reunions where men posed side by side with tight smiles, their arms casually draped over one another's shoulders. To an outsider, these were simple images of friendship. To the men in the photographs, they were visual confirmations of bonds forged in mud and blood, bonds that no post-war marriage, no church service, no patriotic parade could replicate. Some veterans arranged to meet discreetly, traveling to neutral cities like Paris or Amsterdam, where the social climate was slightly more tolerant, or at least more anonymous. They stayed in boarding houses or rented small apartments under assumed names, spending days and nights reconnecting with people who had shared the most terrifying, intimate moments of their lives. These were not always romantic meetings. Sometimes they were simply about sitting together in silence, sharing a cigarette, remembering what it had meant to be young and scared and alive in the trenches. But often they were about reawakening physical touch, about affirming that the connection had not been imaginary, that it had existed and still existed, even if the world pretended otherwise. In other instances, veterans poured their feelings into creative outlets. Literature from the post-war years, though often coded, began to reflect the complicated emotional legacies of trench life. Some writers produced poetry and prose that hinted at the blurred lines between friendship and love, between survival and surrender. Critics at the time often dismissed these works as overly sentimental or stylistically experimental, not realizing or perhaps deliberately ignoring the deeper emotional truths embedded in the text. Visual artists, too, found ways to capture their inner landscapes. Paintings of intertwined bodies, sculptures of faceless figures locked in embrace, became part of the modernist movement's fascination with human form and abstraction. For some veterans, this art was therapy, a way to release the memories that could not be spoken aloud. The rise of psychoanalysis during this period also intersected with these issues. Therapists began to encounter patients who spoke obliquely of wartime experiences that involved more than just battle trauma. In journals from early psychologists, there are notes about veterans describing dreams of trench nights, of the feel of another man's breath in the cold, of the confusion and comfort of bodies intertwined under the threat of death. These notes were often filed away under categories like war neurosis or hysteria, but modern scholars now read them as early documentation of the emotional and sexual complexities of trench life. For some veterans, the inability to reconcile their wartime selves with their peacetime roles led to profound isolation. They withdrew from family life, choosing solitude over the daily negotiation of pretending to be someone they no longer were. Some became alcoholics, drinking to suppress the memories that resurfaced in the quiet hours of the night. Others joined social clubs or veterans groups, where they could at least share space with people who understood the weight of the past, even if they never spoke of the specific details that haunted them. In a few rare cases, veterans found post-war partners who accepted their histories. Some married women who had also experienced war trauma, nurses, ambulance drivers, or women who had lost husbands and were open to relationships that defied conventional structures. These partnerships were often more about companionship than about traditional marriage roles, allowing for quiet agreements that permitted each person their own private spaces. A few veterans even entered into lifelong partnerships with their wartime companions, living together under the guise of friendship or bachelor cohabitation. Society, reluctant to question the arrangements of decorated soldiers, sometimes turned a blind eye, allowing these men to live their truths in quiet defiance of social norms. For the wider society, these undercurrents remained largely invisible. The public memory of World War I focused on sacrifice, victory, and loss in conventional terms. Monuments rose in town squares. Lists of names were carved into stone. Poppies bloomed in remembrance. But there were no monuments to the private pacts, the whispered vows, the love letters that never reached their destinations. The war's emotional casualties remained undocumented. Their stories passed quietly from one generation to the next, if at all. In recent decades, as archives have opened and families have donated personal collections to universities and museums, historians have begun to piece together this hidden history. Letters, diaries, photographs, and even official documents contain clues, phrases that reveal more than their surface meanings. Admissions scribbled in margins, coded notes that, when read with modern understanding, tell a story of human resilience and vulnerability. This part of the war narrative is not about scandal. It is about truth, about acknowledging that in the face of death, people reach for each other in ways that defy categories. They find comfort, love, and survival in forms that may not align with societal expectations, but are deeply, undeniably human. In the next chapter, we will continue this exploration, looking at how the interwar period and the lead-up to the Second World War affected these veterans and their secret histories. We will examine how some men managed to integrate their trench experiences into new social movements, while others recoiled into private lives, shadowed by memories of love and loss that no military decoration could ever recognize or heal. As the years crept toward the Second World War, the veterans of the Great War found themselves living in a world that had moved on, at least on the surface, while inside, they remained tethered to nights in the trenches, to whispered promises and emotional entanglements that could not be erased by parades or medals. The interwar years were marked by political chaos, economic depression, and social change. But for many veterans, the real turmoil remained internal, a private reckoning with the lives they had lived between the sandbags and the barbed wire. Some of them found solace in political activism, channeling their unresolved tensions into labor movements, anti-war protests, or nationalist organizations. Yet beneath the banners and slogans was another layer of personal struggle, an attempt to reconcile the emotional survival tactics of the war with the rigid societal expectations of peacetime. For men who had shared more than just rations and trenches, who had leaned into each other for warmth and sometimes for love, the post-war years remained a delicate balancing act between memory and denial. As new wars loomed on the horizon, the veterans of World War I were both advisors and cautionary ghosts, often summoned to speak of sacrifice, but rarely invited to share the full spectrum of what that sacrifice had entailed. In private, some of them continued to meet, especially in larger cities where anonymity offered safety. Clubs, cafes, and quiet apartments became places where former soldiers could reconnect, sometimes rekindling the emotional and physical relationships that had begun during the war. These meetings were often framed publicly as gatherings of comradeship, reunions of old friends reliving the past. But for some, they were opportunities to briefly step out of the constraints of conventional life and return to the space where they had once found authentic connection under fire. Diaries from the period reveal that these encounters were not always planned, but sometimes happened spontaneously. A glance across a crowded room at a veterans function, a knowing smile at a remembrance event, a chance meeting in a park. The spark of recognition between two men who had once shared more than just battle was an electric moment, fraught with risk, but also with the warmth of understanding. For the veterans who had made wartime pacts of emotional or physical intimacy, the interwar years were filled with secret correspondence. Letters carefully worded, using metaphors and shared memories as code, traveled between countries, crossing oceans, keeping alive the emotional bonds that had been formed in mud and blood. One set of letters between a British veteran named Arthur and a French soldier named Lucien survives today, revealing a complex tapestry of affection, longing, and survival. Arthur wrote, "Sometimes I walk past the river and think of the canal near Amiens, of the way the moon looked that night we both agreed not to speak of after. But silence is a burden I can no longer bear." Lucien replied, "I live now with a wife and children, but there are nights I dream of the trench, of you, of the moments between shellings when we forgot about death for a little while." These letters were never meant for public eyes, but they show the endurance of connection, forged in extreme circumstances. Not all veterans were able to maintain such connections. Some retreated fully into the role society demanded, becoming husbands, fathers, and respectable citizens, while quietly mourning the loss of parts of themselves that had been locked away with their trench gear. For some, the process of forgetting became a kind of self-preservation. They buried their pasts beneath layers of routine, avoiding anything that might trigger the memories of nights spent in another man's arms, or mornings waking up beside someone who understood the terror better than any wife ever could. Yet forgetting is not the same as healing. The emotional debris of war remained embedded in their lives, manifesting in subtle ways: an inability to form deep connections with their spouses, an aversion to physical closeness, a sense of alienation from their communities. Some veterans developed health problems unrelated to their physical injuries, conditions modern psychologists might now recognize as psychosomatic responses to repressed trauma and emotional dissonance. Others coped through writing, even if that writing was kept private. Memoirs written under pseudonyms began to circulate in limited numbers, sometimes self-published or distributed quietly among trusted friends. These texts spoke of the war not in terms of battles and strategies, but in terms of human connection, of the complex relationships that arose when death was a constant companion. In these narratives, love was not a luxury, but a necessity, a way to anchor oneself in a world that had become unmoored from sanity. Art from this period also reflected the internal conflicts of veterans. In paintings, sculptures, and photographs, themes of duality emerged: figures split between light and shadow, bodies intertwined in ways that suggested both comfort and confinement. Some of these works were dismissed by critics as abstract exercises, but those who had lived through the trenches saw in them a mirror of their own divided lives. For those who turned to religion, the experience was equally complicated. Some veterans found solace in faith, framing their wartime relationships as tests of endurance or acts of mercy under duress. Others felt condemned by their religious teachings, believing they had sinned irreparably, and carrying that guilt into confessions whispered to priests or scribbled into journals. A few sought out religious communities that offered a more compassionate view, finding among certain clergy members an understanding that love and survival are not always clean or rule-bound. There are records of chaplains from the war years who continued to correspond with their former soldiers, offering spiritual support without judgment. Aware of the complex moral landscapes these men navigated long after the guns fell silent. As the 1930s progressed and the world tilted once more toward conflict, The veterans of World War I watched with a mixture of dread and resignation. Some volunteered for service again, though they were older now, often relegated to administrative roles or training positions. They carried into this new war the hidden knowledge of what survival costs, a knowledge that included not only the physical dangers, but the emotional compromises required to endure. They watched younger soldiers march off with fresh uniforms and hopeful faces, knowing that many of them would return carrying the same silent burdens. Some tried to warn them, offering advice cloaked in metaphor, but most knew that experience is a teacher that cannot be borrowed, only earned. The veterans who lived through both wars often found themselves haunted, not just by the trauma of battle, but by the layers of personal history that compounded with each passing year. For some, the Second War reopened wounds that had never fully closed. They remembered the faces of those they had loved and lost in the First War, the trench partners who had held them in the dark, the women whose names they whispered while bleeding into the earth. Some wrote new letters to old addresses, knowing the recipients might be gone but needing to write anyway. Others visited old battlegrounds, walking the lines where their younger selves had formed bonds that defied time and social norms. In the post-World War II years, when the world once again tried to rebuild, the veterans of the Great War faded further into the background. They were now elderly, their stories considered part of a distant past, yet for them, the memories were fresh beneath the surface. The love they had shared, the connections they had forged, the nights in the trenches when they had clung to each other not out of lust, but out of the sheer need to survive another hour, all of it remained vivid. Some found themselves sharing these stories in hushed tones with younger generations, choosing grandchildren over children as the recipients of their confessions, perhaps hoping that the distance of time would make the truths easier to bear. These revelations were often met with compassion, sometimes with confusion, but always with the sense that something important was being passed down. A history not found in textbooks, a legacy of emotional complexity that refused to be erased. In the next chapter, we will explore how these veterans influenced the cultural and social shifts of the mid-20th century, how their hidden histories contributed to changing attitudes about love, gender, and intimacy, and how their unspoken stories helped shape a new world that, slowly and imperfectly, began to understand that human connection in times of crisis transcends the rigid categories society tries to enforce as the decades rolled on, and the veterans of World War I aged into the twilight of their lives. The weight of their trench memories did not dissolve, but instead became part of the quiet architecture of their existence, woven into the creases of their faces, the slowness of their steps, and the lingering pauses in their conversations. The emotional debts of the war were never truly paid. They simply aged alongside the men who carried them. For many, the 1950s and 60s brought new waves of reflection, catalyzed by the changing world around them. Society was shifting, old moral codes were being questioned. Psychology was advancing. Literature was daring to say aloud what had only been whispered before, but for the veterans of the trenches. These transformations stirred dormant memories, pushing them to confront long-buried chapters of their personal histories. Some found unexpected comfort in the gradual loosening of social norms. Writers like James Baldwin and poets like Allen Ginsberg were opening the public imagination to the idea that love and intimacy did not always adhere to the rigid frameworks imposed by governments or churches. For veterans who had lived through the emotional crucible of trench life, this cultural shift offered a strange form of validation, albeit decades late. A few began to tentatively write memoirs, not for publication, but for their own children and grandchildren, private documents that spoke, sometimes obliquely and sometimes directly, about the hidden layers of their wartime experiences. In these writings, they confessed to nights shared in dugouts, to promises made between bombardments, to bodies held close not out of desire alone, but out of the simple primal need to survive. They wrote about the fear of dying without ever having felt truly known, and how, in the trenches, they had found moments of intimacy that transcended the horrors around them. For some, these moments involved local women widows or farmers, daughters in occupied villages who offered comfort in exchange for food, protection, or sometimes just companionship. For others, it was their fellow soldiers who became the vessels for this connection, and those memories were more complicated, tied up in social taboos that persisted long after the war had ended. In the privacy of their letters and journals, these men described the way trench life dismantled social hierarchies and gender expectations. A colonel might cry in the arms of a private. A hardened officer might whisper fears into the ear of a subordinate. War had stripped away the pretense of invincibility, leaving only the raw core of humanity exposed. The men who survived carried this knowledge with them into peacetime, but society was not ready to hear it. So they buried these stories beneath layers of silence, performing the roles expected of them: husband, father, grandfather, while a different version of themselves lived quietly in memory. Some tried to bridge this gap through art. The post-war years saw a proliferation of novels, plays, and films that hinted at these hidden truths. Ernest Hemingway, for example, who drove ambulances during the war, wrote works soaked in the quiet desperation of men trying to find meaning after trauma. While his work stopped short of explicitly addressing the trench, intimacies of same-sex affection, or the complicated relationships with women in occupied villages, the subtext resonated with veterans who recognized the coded language of longing and disillusionment. Other writers went further. In France, Jean Cocteau and Jean Genet explored themes of male companionship and emotional entanglement under duress. And while their works were often dismissed as avant-garde or controversial, they struck a chord with those who had lived through the brutal intimacy of war. For the veterans themselves, these cultural shifts were both comforting and destabilizing. On the one hand, they saw a world beginning to understand that love and need could not always be contained within traditional definitions. On the other hand, the passage of time had made some of their memories feel distant, like echoes from a life they no longer inhabited. Yet the body remembers what the mind tries to forget, and as age weakened their limbs, it often sharpened their recollections. Many veterans in their final years returned to the places where their memories had been forged. Pilgrimages to the battlefields of France and Belgium became more common in the 1960s and 70s, as elderly soldiers stood in cemeteries and fields, trying to reconcile the landscapes of their minds with the peaceful vistas now spread before them. Some visited the graves of fallen comrades, not only to pay respects, but to privately mourn lost lovers, secret partners whose names could not be spoken at family gatherings, but who remained alive in memory, frozen in time at the age they had been when war took them. Others visited the villages where they had once found temporary sanctuary in the arms of local women, searching for old faces, finding sometimes only gravestones or the children of those women now grown, who may or may not have known the full story of their parentage. Letters were written on these trips, sometimes left at gravesites, sometimes mailed to addresses scribbled from memory. These letters, when found in estates and archives decades later, reveal the raw confessions of men finally unburdening themselves of the weight of silence. They wrote of love that did not fit the mold society had carved for them, of nights when they chose to live through touch rather than surrender to despair, of promises made in the mud that they could not keep in the light of day, but never forgot. These documents are rare but invaluable, providing historians and descendants with a fuller, more honest picture of what it meant to survive World War I, not just in body, but in heart. For the children and grandchildren of these veterans, the revelations could be jarring. Discovering letters that spoke of same-sex love in the trenches, or of affairs with local women left behind after the war, forced families to rethink the identities of the men they had loved and admired. Some responded with acceptance, understanding that war creates realities that peacetime cannot judge. Others struggled, caught between the idealized image of the stoic, heroic veteran and the complex, vulnerable human being revealed in ink-stained pages. In academic circles, these discoveries began to reshape the narrative of World War I. No longer could historians focus solely on military tactics and political consequences. They now had to account for the human dimension, the ways in which war bends and reshapes love, loyalty, and identity. Museums began to include personal letters in their exhibits, curators carefully framing these stories, not as scandals, but as truths long suppressed by social convention. Workshops and conferences convened to discuss the emotional histories of war, bringing together scholars, veterans' families, and even the veterans themselves when possible, to share and process these hidden chapters of history. The psychological community also began to pay attention. Therapists and counselors working with aging veterans or their descendants found that these conversations opened doors to healing that had been locked for decades. The trauma of war was no longer seen as only physical or tactical. It was recognized as emotional and sexual, tied to the core of human connection. This shift influenced not only how veterans' stories were told, but how future wars would be understood. The legacy of trench intimacy, of love born from survival, of pacts made in the shadows of death, became part of a broader dialogue about the costs of conflict. These stories illuminated the truth that when civilization collapses into war, the human heart does not stop needing touch, comfort, and connection. It simply finds new ways to achieve them, however forbidden or temporary. As the last veterans of World War I approached the ends of their lives, many chose to speak more openly. Deathbed confessions became more common, not out of guilt, but out of a desire to be known fully before passing on. Some of these stories were recorded, others shared in private letters to family members, who then chose whether to keep the secrets or release them into the historical record. These final acts of honesty added depth to the fading echoes of the Great War, transforming the understanding of what it meant to endure such a cataclysm. In the next chapter, we will continue to explore how these emotional legacies influenced not just individual families, but the broader cultural shifts of the 20th century, from evolving views on masculinity and love to the seeds of social change planted by a generation that learned, in the trenches, that love and survival are often the same thing. As the 20th century moved deeper into its middle decades, the emotional legacies of World War I veterans quietly seeped into the social fabric of nations that preferred to forget the more complicated aspects of the war experience. Official remembrances continued to focus on bravery, sacrifice, and national pride, yet beneath the grand speeches and annual parades, there lingered the quieter, less convenient truth that millions of men had lived through an emotional apocalypse, as profound as the physical one, and many of them had formed bonds in the trenches that did not fit the expected narratives of loyalty and heroism. These were stories of survival, of bodies pressed together in cold dugouts, of whispered promises exchanged under shellfire, of secret kisses shared behind supply tents and in shadowed corners of bombed-out villages. In the post-war decades, these memories did not fade, but evolved into something more complicated, especially as veterans watched a new generation march toward new wars. The soldiers of the Great War became the fathers and grandfathers of the soldiers of World War II, and in some cases, they saw their own sons conscripted into conflicts that reignited the trauma they had tried to bury. For those who had survived the trenches by forging intimate bonds with their fellow soldiers, whether through friendship, love, or quiet physical comfort, the rise of another global war reopened wounds that had never fully closed. Some veterans feared for their sons, not just because of the bullets and bombs, but because they knew, perhaps better than anyone, the emotional battleground awaiting them. They knew what it meant to stand in mud for months, to watch friends die. In agony, to feel one's humanity fracture under the relentless weight of fear and fatigue. They also knew the deep, secret solace of a companion's hand in the dark, of bodies seeking warmth, not merely from the cold, but from the void of death that hovered over every trench. These memories resurfaced as their children marched off to war, but the veterans rarely spoke of them, instead choosing to offer conventional advice about bravery, duty, and endurance. The emotional complexities of their own survival remained, tucked away, folded into the creases of old letters, or locked in drawers alongside faded photographs and medals. Some men revisited the past in private, rereading wartime diaries by candlelight in quiet rooms while their families slept, tracing their fingers over words written in younger hands, words about nights shared with another soldier, about stolen hours in the arms of a French or Belgian woman whose name they never spoke aloud at home. These personal archives became emotional relics, untouched by official history, but alive in the inner worlds of the men who wrote them. For some veterans, the post-World War II years brought unexpected opportunities for reflection. As social movements in the 1950s and 60s began to challenge traditional views of masculinity, gender, and sexuality, a few of the aging soldiers found in these shifts a mirror for their own experiences. The early gay rights movement, though still fragile, and often met with violence and ridicule, sparked in some veterans a private sense of recognition. They read about the Stonewall riots in New York, or saw news of protests in London and Paris, and felt, for the first time, that the world might one day be able to understand the hidden parts of their wartime survival. Yet for most, the silence remained. Decades of repression had calcified into habit. The trenches had taught them how to compartmentalize, how to lock away feelings that could not be expressed without risking ruin. They had learned to live with contradictions, to be proud of their service but haunted by their memories, to love their families but mourn the loves they had lost or abandoned in the mud of Europe, to walk through life with medals on their chests and secrets in their hearts. Some of these men continued to meet in veterans' clubs, where unspoken understandings existed between those who shared the same hidden histories. A touch on the shoulder, a glance across the room, the way a story would trail off into silence. At just the right moment, these were the languages of memory and loyalty that survived long after official accounts had been written. In the libraries of Europe and North America, archivists slowly uncovered more personal documents from the war years. Estate sales brought in trunks filled with letters and photographs, sometimes donated by descendants who didn't know what to do with them. Among these papers were love letters between soldiers, confessions of moments shared between comrades, and diaries filled with entries about fear, longing, and physical closeness that blurred the lines of friendship and romance. Historians began to realize that the emotional economy of World War I had been vastly more complicated than previous generations had acknowledged. The traditional narrative of trench camaraderie, the stiff upper lip, stories of brotherhood, was accurate but incomplete. Beneath the shared cigarettes and foxhole jokes was an undercurrent of human need that included not only companionship but affection, tenderness, and sometimes love in forms that defied the social codes of the time. For the veterans who were still alive, watching their personal stories surface in academic articles or museum exhibits was a bittersweet experience. Some felt relief, knowing that their hidden histories might finally be understood or at least acknowledged. Others felt fear, worrying that these revelations would dishonor the public image of their service or reopen old wounds they had spent a lifetime trying to seal. A few participated in oral history projects, offering carefully edited versions of their pasts, testing the waters to see how much truth the world could handle. Others refused, preferring to take their full stories to the grave. Yet for all of them, the knowledge remained. War had changed them in ways that peacetime society could never fully comprehend. Their experiences had taught them that love and survival are often intertwined, that in the darkest hours of human history, people reach for each other in ways that cannot always be categorized or explained. They had learned, often painfully, that the human heart does not stop needing connection just because a uniform is worn or a rifle is carried. They had lived through nights when the difference between life and death was measured not just in inches of mud, but in the presence of another person's breath beside them. The memories of those nights, whether shared with fellow soldiers or with civilians in war-torn villages, did not fade with time. They remained vivid, even as faces aged and bodies failed. Some veterans described these memories in their final letters written to children or grandchildren, attempting to pass on not just tales of battle, but the emotional truths of war. They wanted future generations to understand that bravery is not always about charging into gunfire. Sometimes it is about holding someone's hand in the dark and knowing that, for that moment, you are both still alive. In the nursing homes and hospital wards where many veterans spent their last years, staff sometimes overheard whispered names in the middle of the night, remnants of long-forgotten relationships that surfaced in moments of dementia or fevered dreams. Nurses wrote down these names, wondering who they were, piecing together clues from the fragments of stories told by aging men who no longer had the strength to censor themselves. Some families discovered old photographs tucked behind picture frames or hidden in the backs of drawers, images of young men in uniform, standing too close, smiling in ways that suggested more than friendship. For these families, the discoveries brought a mix of emotions: shock, curiosity, and in some cases, compassion. As the last World War I veterans died, they left behind not just a legacy of military service, but a shadow archive of human experience that historians are still uncovering. Letters, diaries, and photographs tell stories of survival not just against bullets and gas, but against loneliness, fear, and the crushing isolation of war. These documents remind us that in the worst conditions imaginable, people find ways to create connection, to sustain each other, to survive not just physically, but emotionally. The trenches of World War I were more than just places of death. They were spaces where life, in all its complicated, messy forms, persisted. In the next chapter, we will look at how these hidden histories influenced the post-war cultural shifts of the 20th century, how they contributed to the quiet revolutions in literature, psychology, and social thought, and how the echoes of trench intimacy continue to shape the way we understand love, war, and survival today. As the post-war decades unfolded and the 20th century progressed into an era of social transformation. The private stories of World War I veterans, their forbidden loves, trench intimacies, and emotional pacts formed under fire, began to exert a subtle but undeniable influence on cultural consciousness. Even if most of these men never publicly spoke of their experiences, their silence, paradoxically, became a form of transmission. It seeded the creative arts, altered familial legacies, and indirectly fueled revolutions in literature, psychology, and gender theory. These veterans, many of whom carried unspoken emotional histories from the trenches into the fabric of civilian life, became quiet conduits of social change, their memories feeding into a broader cultural shift, even if their mouths remained closed. The love they had found in the mud, the bodies they had clung to in terror, the local women they had left behind, and the soldiers whose hands they had held until the last breath, all of it left fingerprints on the post-war world, shaping the undercurrents of modern intimacy in ways that history books often fail to acknowledge. Some of the veterans lived to see the world catch up to their silent truths. In the 1960s and 70s, as social norms loosened and the sexual revolution unfolded across Europe and North America, old soldiers watched a new generation of poets, playwrights, and artists depict love and sexuality without shame. For some, it felt like a vindication they had never dared to hope for. For others, it stirred confusion and even bitterness. They had lived through decades of hiding, of folding secret memories into the corners of their lives, and now the world seemed suddenly ready to embrace what they had once been punished, or at least silenced, for feeling. In private, some veterans wrote letters to these new cultural figures, anonymous notes of gratitude or cautious confessions sent to artists who had captured their internal struggles in metaphor and verse. A few of these letters survive in archives, tucked into the collections of writers who understood what they were reading but never revealed the identities of the correspondents. One letter, found among the papers of a French playwright known for his explorations of male friendship, reads, "I was in the trenches at Verdun. I held a man's hand, not because of love or sex, but because it was the only thing that kept me alive. After the war, I tried to forget it, but I never could. Thank you for reminding me that what I did was human." These moments of cross-generational connection, though few and mostly hidden, illustrate the quiet ripple effect that trench intimacy had on the cultural evolution of the 20th century. Some veterans became involved, quietly and anonymously, in the early gay rights movements, providing financial support or moral encouragement from the shadows. Others shared their wartime experiences in controlled settings, such as therapy groups, for veterans or private conversations with trusted friends, but rarely in public. Still, their stories seeped into the broader consciousness, influencing literature, film, and social thought in ways that historians are only now beginning to fully map. The post-war literary canon reflects this legacy in coded and sometimes overt ways. Novels about war, written in the 1950s and 60s, began to focus less on heroism and more on the more psychological complexities of men thrown together in impossible circumstances. The bonds formed between soldiers, once depicted as pure camaraderie, were now portrayed with richer emotional textures, layers of dependence, longing, and blurred lines between friendship and desire. These narratives resonated with readers because they spoke to universal human needs, intensified by the extremity of war. Even works that did not explicitly mention same-sex intimacy or emotional infidelity hinted at the deep undercurrents of trench life, the longing for touch, the fear of dying alone, the desperate hunger for connection in the face of annihilation. Filmmakers, too, began to tell stories that danced along the edges of these truths. Scenes of soldiers sharing cigarettes in rain-soaked dugouts, of gazes held too long, of hands lingering on shoulders, became cinematic shorthand for emotional intimacy that transcended friendship. The audiences of the time might not have openly acknowledged these cues, but the veterans in the darkened theaters often recognized the echoes of their own lives flickering on the screen. Some wept silently, finally seeing pieces of themselves reflected in art, even if the world still lacked the language to discuss it openly. In the field of psychology, the impact of World War I's emotional history began to surface through studies of trauma, grief, and the human need for connection under duress. Early psychoanalysts, some of whom had treated shell-shocked soldiers, began to understand that the war had created not just physical injuries, but ruptures in identity and sexuality. Terms like emotional substitution appeared in clinical literature, referring to the way soldiers bonded with each other as replacements for absent families and lovers. Modern researchers now read these studies as early, albeit veiled, acknowledgments of the complex emotional and sexual survival mechanisms born in the trenches. Some veterans participated in these studies under conditions of strict confidentiality, finally able to speak of their experiences in therapeutic settings, where they were not judged but analyzed, their stories contributing to the growing understanding of trauma's long-term effects on the human psyche. These conversations influenced the development of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a recognized condition, and broadened the field's approach to include not just fear of death, but the grief of lost love, the weight of unresolved attachments, and the haunting memory of intimate moments that could not be recreated or discussed in civilian life. For the families of these veterans, the legacies often remained obscured. Children and grandchildren inherited boxes of letters, diaries, and photographs, but did not always understand their significance. Some found pictures of two men standing close together, arms wrapped around each other in ways that seemed too tender for mere friendship. Others read letters filled with longing and private jokes that hinted at something deeper, but stopped short of clarity. In many cases, these descendants chose silence, respecting the privacy of the dead or fearing the disruption of family narratives that had been built around simpler, more acceptable versions of the past. But in some cases, these discoveries prompted reevaluations of family history, leading to new understandings of the emotional complexity of their ancestors' lives. Academics and archivists played a crucial role in preserving these materials, recognizing that the personal artifacts of war, especially those that spoke of love, sex, and emotional dependency, were as historically significant as battlefield maps and political treaties. Universities and museums began to collect and catalog these documents, carefully contextualizing them to avoid sensationalism while acknowledging their importance. Exhibitions emerged, not just about military strategy, but about the human cost of war in emotional terms. Visitors to these exhibits sometimes found themselves unexpectedly moved, confronted by the tender letters of soldiers who wrote not just to wives or sweethearts back home, but to each other, weaving a narrative of human connection that transcended the binaries of traditional historical storytelling. As the century moved toward its close, the last living veterans of World War I began to die. With their passing came a new urgency to capture the full scope of their experiences. Oral history. Projects raced to record their voices, to collect their stories before they were lost to time. Some of these final interviews included confessions, whispered into microphones by men who had carried their secrets for decades, now too old to care about social consequences, but still burdened by the weight of memory. These recordings are now part of archives around the world, offering future generations a glimpse into a side of the war that was never taught in classrooms. They speak of trench nights when love and survival became indistinguishable, of the women left behind in villages and the men left behind in cemeteries, of the letters never sent and the hands never held again. The veterans' voices crack as they speak, but in those cracks is a history more honest than any battlefield report. In the next chapter, we will explore how the stories of trench intimacy and emotional survival continued to ripple into the 21st century, influencing modern discussions about masculinity, trauma, and the human need for connection during crisis, and how the echoes of these forgotten loves still resonate in contemporary understandings of what it means to endure war, not just with the body, but with the heart. As the world transitioned into the 21st century, the last physical traces of World War I began to fade from living memory, but the emotional and cultural footprints of the war, especially the hidden histories of trench intimacy, secret affairs, and wartime love, continued to echo, shaping the modern understanding of human connection under crisis. With the passing of the final veterans, scholars and families alike were left to piece together the fragments of private lives from letters, diaries, photographs, and whispered confessions that had survived not by design, but by accident or stubborn memory. Museums, libraries, and archives found themselves inheriting boxes of documents that had remained sealed for decades, often bequeathed by descendants who no longer wished to carry the burden of secrecy. or who finally felt the cultural climate had shifted enough to allow the truth to be acknowledged without scandal. These collections revealed a side of World War, one that had long been kept out of public narratives. Not just the mud and gas masks, not just the medals and the dead, but the soft, vulnerable moments that soldiers clung to when everything else was stripped away, the touches in the dark, the shared cigarettes that led to shared cots, the bonds with local women that blurred the lines between relief and love, and the lifelong scars of emotions that could never be fully named. In this new century, historians and psychologists began to frame these discoveries not as aberrations, but as integral parts of war's human toll. The term emotional survival strategy became part of the academic lexicon, used to describe how soldiers in the trenches created relationships that transcended conventional categories of friendship, romance, or sexual orientation. The need for connection became a central theme in war studies, and scholars started to see intimacy during conflict not as a side story, but as a core element of how people withstand prolonged exposure to trauma. The letters between soldiers, sometimes explicit, sometimes coded, were now studied alongside battle reports and strategic analyses. Historians stopped asking whether these relationships really happened and started asking how they shaped the lives of those involved, how they altered the post-war world in ways both public and private. Some of the letters detailed secret trysts between comrades, moments of desperation that became moments of solace. Lines like, "Your hand in mine was the only thing that kept me sane last winter," or, "I have never wanted to survive anything as badly as I wanted to survive. Just one more night beside you." Others revealed the complexities of relationships with women in war zones, not just transactional encounters, but ongoing emotional attachments that soldiers carried back with them to marriages and families they no longer recognized as their sole reality. A few letters confessed guilt, but more often they confessed confusion expressions of men grappling with the fact that love, sex, and survival had collided in the trenches in ways no one had prepared them for. In response to these findings, modern veterans from later conflicts began to speak more openly about their own experiences, seeing in the World War one letters a mirror of their private struggles. Soldiers from Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan started to share stories of emotional dependency, of the complex bonds formed in combat that sometimes crossed into physical intimacy, or at the very least into a depth of connection that defied traditional masculine roles. The long arc of history, it turned out, was not linear, but circular human beings in extreme situations, reaching for each other in ways that made sense in the moment, even if those moments defied peacetime logic. Documentaries and books emerged, focusing not just on battles, but on the emotional landscapes of war. Films explored the blurred lines of trench life, depicting soldiers not merely as fighters, but as fragile human beings trying to hold on to their sanity by holding on to each other. These stories resonated with modern audiences, perhaps because the 21st century brought with it a new willingness to acknowledge the complexity of human relationships. Social media platforms, memoirs, and podcasts opened up spaces for veterans to share their unfiltered experiences, and in doing so, they validated the emotional truths carried by their World War I predecessors. The rise of trauma studies and the normalization of therapy further shifted the conversation. PTSD was no longer seen as a weakness, but as a natural consequence of human bodies and minds pushed beyond their limits. And with this new understanding came room for discussions about love and sex during war, not as deviance or betrayal, but as coping mechanisms, ways to carve out moments of life in the middle of death. Academic conferences on military history now included panels on gender, sexuality, and emotional survival. Historians debated not whether trench intimacy had existed, but how it had been recorded, erased, and now recovered. Letters between soldiers were published in collections, sometimes anonymously, to protect remaining family members, other times with full attribution when descendants chose to honor their ancestors. Full stories rather than a sanitized version. Curators created museum exhibits that included these narratives, placing tender letters and photographs beside helmets and bayonets, acknowledging that the human experience of war could not be reduced to tactics and timelines alone. This shift rippled into the broader culture. Literature classes taught war novels with an eye toward the emotional subtext, reading not just for plot, but for the undercurrents of longing and loss that pulsed beneath the surface. Theater productions revived plays that had once been too controversial. For mainstream audiences, now celebrated for their honesty about the complexities of male relationships in times of crisis. Film and television began to portray soldiers with more emotional nuance, allowing characters to express vulnerability without stripping them of heroism. The descendants of World War I veterans found themselves re-examining family histories. New eyes. A grandson might discover a letter in an attic and read it differently than his father would have, understanding now that the phrase, "I miss you in ways I cannot explain," carried layers of meaning that extended beyond brotherhood. Some families chose to share these letters publicly, donating them to archives or publishing them online, contributing to a growing digital record of human resilience and complexity. In academic circles, scholars coined new terms like trench, love, and crisis intimacy to describe the phenomenon, acknowledging that the conditions of war create emotional needs that do not fit into neat societal boxes. This research influenced not only historical understanding, but also contemporary military support systems, prompting discussions about how modern armies could better prepare soldiers for the emotional aftermath of war, not just the trauma of violence, but the dislocation that comes from forming life-saving bonds in a world that often has no place for them afterward. These conversations led to policy changes in some military organizations, with mental health support programs beginning to address the full spectrum of emotional experiences during deployment, including the complexities of same-sex relationships, deep friendships, and the psychological impact of leaving behind wartime companions. The legacy of World War I trench intimacy thus became more than a footnote in history. It became a catalyst for rethinking how humanity understands love, connection, and survival in extreme conditions. Universities introduced interdisciplinary courses on war and intimacy, blending history, literature, psychology, and gender studies to teach students about the realities behind the battle lines. Museums expanded their exhibits to include personal artifacts that told stories of emotional endurance, challenging visitors to consider the private costs of public wars. Even governments began to acknowledge the broader impacts of military service, sponsoring studies on veteran loneliness and emotional trauma that included questions about relationships formed during conflict. For the remaining families of World War I veterans, these shifts offered a kind of retroactive healing. Great-grandchildren read the letters and diaries of their ancestors, not with judgment, but with compassion, recognizing that love and survival are rarely simple, especially in the face of war. Some held family gatherings where these documents were read aloud for the first time, creating new traditions of remembrance that honored the full humanity of those who had served. In literature, new novels emerged inspired by the rediscovered letters of trench soldiers, blending fact and fiction to explore the rich emotional terrain of wartime life. Filmmakers, too, took up the challenge, producing works that depicted trench intimacy not as scandal, but as a natural part of the human condition under siege. These narratives reached audiences hungry for stories that reflect the real cost of war, not just the death counts, but the lives lived in the margins, the hands held in secret, the hearts broken quietly while the world watched parades. As the century advanced, the lessons of World War I continued to influence how societies approached the emotional dimensions of conflict. The idea that war is not just fought with guns, but with hearts, became part of the broader cultural understanding, taught in schools, explored in art, and integrated into mental health practices. In the next chapter, we will explore how these evolving narratives continue to shape present-day military culture, influence modern relationships, and challenge the world to reconsider the stories it tells about bravery, love, and what it truly means to survive. By the time the 21st century settled into its third decade, the echoes of World War I trench life, its secret loves, unspoken alliances, and emotional entanglements, had woven themselves into the broader cultural fabric of how society understands war, trauma, and the human need for intimacy in the face of annihilation. The stories that had once been whispered, hidden in letters or buried in private diaries, were now part of an open dialogue, influencing everything from veteran support programs to academic theory, from novels and films to therapy rooms where the descendants of soldiers unpacked the emotional inheritances passed down through generations. The last direct participants of the Great War had long since died, their bodies gone, but their experiences preserved in archives, books, and family collections that continued to surface in dusty attics and forgotten trunks, revealing layer after layer of complexity about what it truly meant to survive that unprecedented conflict. Researchers began to connect the emotional legacy of World War I with contemporary phenomena understanding. For example, how the patterns of silence established by trench survivors shaped mid-20th century ideas of masculinity, stoicism, and the repression of vulnerability. For decades, men had been taught to model their behavior on the veterans who returned home quiet, distant, and emotionally sealed off. But the real stories behind that silent stories of love shared in the shadows, of relationships formed under duress, of promises whispered in muddy dugouts, were only now coming fully into view. These hidden histories reframed the entire notion of courage and survival, challenging the cultural scripts that had long defined military service and male identity. The ripple effects reached into literature departments, psychology conferences, and even military academies, where cadets were taught not only battlefield tactics, but the emotional realities of combat life, including the bonds that form when life is stripped to its barest essentials. The letters of World War I veterans, now digitized and accessible online, became teaching tools in classrooms, allowing students to read first-hand accounts of nights spent holding another soldier's hand while bombs exploded overhead, of the guilt and relief that came from finding solace in unexpected places, of the complicated web of attachments that could neither be celebrated nor fully erased. Some of these letters detailed moments of physical intimacy, described not in erotic terms, but as acts of survival. I did not think of sin or honor. One letter read, "Only of the warmth of his skin against mine when the frost came and the world felt like it was ending." Other letters spoke of love affairs with local women in war-torn villages, relationships that lasted weeks or months, but left permanent marks on the soldiers who returned home to wives and families that no longer felt like their only reality. In therapy rooms around the world, descendants of these veterans found themselves processing inherited grief, sometimes without realizing the origin. They spoke of grandfathers who never hugged their children, of fathers who returned from war, emotionally hollowed, of family secrets hinted at but never explained. With the cultural shift toward understanding trauma and emotional resilience, therapists now recognize these patterns not just as isolated dysfunctions, but as part of a larger historical chain reaction set off by the war's intimate ruptures. Scholars of intergenerational trauma began to include trench intimacy in their research, acknowledging that unspoken love, forbidden connection, and unresolved emotional survival strategies could transmit psychological echoes across decades. In the arts, the legacy of trench love found new expression. Contemporary playwrights wrote stories about young men in the trenches, discovering each other in moments between shellings, about the moral and emotional negotiations required to survive another day, while knowing death could come at any moment. Novelists crafted narratives where the battlefield was not just a setting for heroism, but a crucible where love and fear entwined, where identities fractured and reassembled in ways that peacetime society still struggled to accommodate. Filmmakers, freed from the censorship and conservatism of earlier eras, depicted these realities on screen, choosing authenticity over sanitized patriotism. One critically acclaimed film portrayed a love story between two soldiers at the Somme, their relationship unfolding amid mud, lice, and the constant percussion of artillery. The script drawn almost directly from real letters found in war archives. Viewers saw not just war's brutality, but its strange, tender underbelly, the way men clung to each other, not merely to fend off cold, but to remember they were still human. Military organizations, too, slowly adapted. Some modern armed forces began including psychological training modules that addressed the emotional bonds formed during combat, including the complexities of same-sex intimacy or temporary relationships that blurred into romance under pressure. Veterans returning from recent conflicts reported that knowing these experiences had historical precedence helped them process their own feelings, reducing shame and isolation. Support groups for modern soldiers began using trench literature as discussion broncs, allowing war stories from a century ago to open doors for current warriors to speak about their own moments of closeness, their own confessions of need, and love during deployment. This shift also reached academic institutions. University courses on the history of war no longer confined themselves to strategy and geopolitics, but included units on emotional survival, studying the way love and sexuality operated in the trenches, not as footnotes, but as essential parts of the wartime experience. Students read the letters aloud in seminars, their voices trembling over lines like, "I miss your shoulder in the dark, more than I miss the dawn," recognizing in these words a profound human truth that transcended time. Museums expanded there. Exhibits, no longer content with displays of rifles and uniforms alone. Interactive installations allowed visitors to read soldiers' private writings, to listen to recordings of actors reading the letters of men who had died long ago, but whose words still vibrated with immediacy and tenderness. Some museums included spaces where visitors could leave their own reflections, acknowledging the universal nature of longing and connection during crisis. The literary world embraced this history with new passion. Anthologies of wartime letters were published, some focusing specifically on love between soldiers, others including the stories of affairs with local women who had been erased from history because their roles complicated the narrative of loyal wives waiting at home. These collections sold widely, resonating with readers who were tired of simplistic war stories and hungry for accounts that acknowledged the full scope of human need. Even the descendants of these forgotten loves, the children born of trench affairs, the grandchildren of men who had whispered to each other in the dark found spaces to share their stories, writing memoirs or participating in oral history, projects that connected their personal family histories to the larger cultural reckoning with World War I's emotional aftermath. Social media platforms provided forums for these stories to circulate widely, creating digital communities where people shared discoveries of old letters, photographs of men in uniform standing just a little too close, notes scrawled in margins that finally made sense in a new, more open era. In this evolving landscape, the very definitions of bravery and survival shifted. No longer were they confined to acts of physical endurance or battlefield heroics. Emotional courage, the willingness to reach for another person in moments of despair, to find warmth in places that peacetime morality might not have sanctioned, became recognized as a form of heroism in itself. Scholars published papers arguing that trench intimacy was not a deviation from wartime experience, but a fundamental part of it, an adaptive response to an inhuman situation that forced human beings into desperate, beautiful, and sometimes heartbreaking acts of connection. In families across the world, the conversations changed. Where once there had been silence, there was now room for acknowledgement. Great-grandchildren asked questions their parents never dared to, reading aloud the letters. They found, not with shame, but with reverence for the complexity of their ancestors' lives. Communities held public readings of trench letters. Theater companies staged performances based on real correspondence. And documentaries aired on mainstream platforms, telling the stories of soldiers who had loved quietly, survived bravely, and died carrying secrets that the modern world was finally ready to honor. In the next chapter, we will explore how this ongoing reckoning with trench intimacy has influenced not only the remembrance of World War I, but also contemporary ideas about love, masculinity, trauma, and what it truly means to stand together in the face of annihilation. Not just with weapons, but with open hearts. Open hearts. By the time the centenary of World War I arrived in 2014, the cultural and emotional landscapes surrounding its remembrance had shifted dramatically, finally beginning to accommodate the complex, often unspoken stories of love, intimacy, and emotional survival that had been hidden in the margins for nearly a century. Global commemorations, documentaries, and museum exhibits acknowledge the usual narratives of loss and heroism. But alongside them, a quieter revolution was taking place, a reckoning with the human side of the war that had long been considered too delicate, too scandalous, or too complicated to address. The secret loves of soldiers, the affairs with local women in war-torn villages, the shared beds and whispered promises between trench comrades were no longer whispered about in academic footnotes or locked away in private archives. They became part of the mainstream dialogue about what it meant to survive a war that crushed not only bodies, but souls. Families across Europe and beyond began opening old boxes of letters, bringing them into the light and finding within them words that revealed a side of the war that had been quietly carried from generation to generation. These letters did not only speak of battlefield horrors, but of deep, emotional ties formed in impossible circumstances lines like, "I think of you every night in the cold, and it is your hand I remember, not my rifle." Or, "We shared bread, but more than that, we shared breaths and dreams of life beyond this mud." These personal artifacts, once considered too private or too confusing to interpret, were now recognized as critical parts of the historical record. Some families donated these letters to universities and libraries, contributing to new collections that focused specifically on wartime intimacy, on the bonds that soldiers formed with each other and with civilians, bonds that often complicated or contradicted the official stories of patriotic sacrifice and heterosexual fidelity. Historians launched projects to compile these documents, building databases of correspondence that shed light on the endless emotional survival strategies of the men in the trenches. Universities began offering seminars and symposiums dedicated to studying the ways war rewrites the rules of love and connection, acknowledging that, in the shadow of death, human beings do not cease to crave closeness, they crave it more intensely. Students read aloud letters between soldiers who had loved each other in secret, who had made pacts under shellfire to protect one another not just from bullets, but from loneliness, from madness, from the existential terror of knowing that tomorrow might not come. These readings were met not with discomfort, but with a solemn understanding that war strips away the artificial constructs of peacetime and forces human beings to improvise new forms of family and partnership. Some of these relationships were temporary, born out of necessity, but others endured, quietly shaping post-war lives even if they could never be publicly named. The centenary brought renewed attention to the women whose lives had been intertwined with the soldiers' emotional survival. Many local women in France, Belgium, and other occupied territories had offered more than just physical comfort. They had provided emotional refuge to soldiers whose spirits were crumbling. Historians collected oral histories from descendants of these women, unearthing stories of relationships that defied simple labels. Some soldiers had fathered children in these war zones, promising to return after the armistice, but never doing so. Others kept secret correspondences for decades, writing to the women they had loved abroad even after returning to marriages back home. For these women, and the children who came from these relationships, the centenary became a moment of bittersweet recognition. For years, they had lived in the shadows of official history, their stories dismissed or ignored, but now they were finally being heard. Conferences were held in cities like Paris and London, where scholars and family members came together to discuss these hidden histories. The conversations were not always comfortable. Grappling with the emotional betrayals that war necessitates is never easy, but they were necessary, and they marked a turning point in how World War I is remembered. Museums updated their exhibits, adding panels about trench intimacy, about the ways soldiers coped with the collapse of normal life by reaching for each other in the dark. Some museums displayed reproductions of love letters, placing them alongside rifles and helmets, reminding visitors that war is not only about strategy and weaponry, but about the fragile human hearts trapped inside uniforms. Art installations were commissioned to reflect these themes: sculptures of intertwined hands, multimedia presentations that layered the sounds of bombs over whispered words of comfort, exchanged between soldiers in the night. Artists collaborated with historians, creating performances that blended documentary material with dramatization, bringing to life the personal stories that had been silenced for so long. In literature, novels and memoirs continued to emerge, drawing from the newly available archives of trench correspondence. Writers crafted stories that honored the complexity of wartime love, acknowledging that in moments of extreme vulnerability, people find ways to comfort each other that transcend social norms. Some of these works won literary prizes, reflecting a growing cultural hunger for narratives that did not simplify the human experience of war into black and white heroics, but explored the gray, emotional spaces where survival actually happens. Psychology, too, evolved, incorporating these insights into therapy for modern soldiers and veterans. Therapists began to understand that intimacy formed in combat, whether sexual, romantic, or purely emotional, can leave lasting imprints that must be processed and honored, not erased. Some modern veterans read the letters from World War I and found their own experiences reflected there, realizing that they were not alone in their confusion, their guilt, or their longing. Support groups included readings of trench diaries as part of healing rituals, helping veterans across generations understand that what they had felt was not unique to them, but part of a long, human tradition of surviving war by holding on to each other. Documentaries aired on major networks, telling the stories of soldiers who had written to one another not about battles, but about love, fear, and tenderness. Viewers around the world saw reenactments of these letters being read aloud, often by the descendants of the letter writers, bringing the words to life in voices trembling with inherited emotion. These documentaries became teaching tools in schools, helping students understand that war is not just about tactics and dates, but about people, real people, who needed warmth, touch, and connection as much as they needed ammunition and orders. Social media platforms created spaces where people shared stories of their ancestors, posting scanned letters, photographs of young men in uniforms leaning just a little too close to each other, snapshots of soldiers resting their heads on one another's shoulders, not just for a photograph, but because in that moment, it was the only way to feel alive. Hashtags like #TrenchLove and #HiddenHistories trended briefly during centenary events, creating virtual memorials that honored not just the dead, but the complex, messy, beautiful emotional lives they had led while waiting to die. In military academies, the curriculum broadened. Cadets read about not only logistics and leadership, but about the psychological weight of command, the emotional survival techniques of soldiers, and the importance of recognizing the human need for connection in combat zones. Some instructors used the letters from World War I as case studies, asking students to imagine what it must have felt like to lie in mud for months, knowing you might not see morning, and to consider how they would lead men who formed such deep attachments under those conditions. This education aimed not just to create better officers, but to create more compassionate leaders, aware that war changes the heart as much as it changes the body. Families, too, began to integrate these histories into their private acts of remembrance. Memorial ceremonies included the reading of love letters, alongside official proclamations of valor. Descendants stood in cemeteries. Reading aloud the words their great-grandfathers had written not to governments or commanders, but to the men and women they loved in secret, the people who had made life in the trenches bearable for just one more day. These acts of remembrance redefined what it meant to honor the past, moving beyond flags and anthems to embrace the full, complicated humanity of those who had served. In the next chapter, we will explore how these shifts in cultural memory continue to evolve, how the lessons of trench intimacy inform modern discussions about gender, love, and emotional survival, and how a century-old war still teaches us that, in the face of destruction, the human heart finds a way to reach for connection, no matter the cost. As the cultural reckoning with World War I's emotional undercurrents continued to unfold, the narratives of trench intimacy and wartime love began to ripple far beyond historical inquiry, influencing broader conversations about human relationships, vulnerability, and the psychology of survival in crisis. The centenary had opened the floodgates, but what followed was not merely a brief moment of reflection. It was a profound shift in how societies understood the intersection of trauma, affection, and emotional endurance. In classrooms, therapy sessions, film festivals, and family living rooms, people began to speak more openly about the parts of war history that had once been locked away in shame or fear. The moments when survival had depended not just on tactics or brute strength, but on the human need to be seen, held, and loved amid the chaos. Scholars traced how these forgotten stories had quietly influenced generations of art, literature, and social behavior. They pointed to the subtle yet undeniable ways in which trench life had redefined masculinity, not the public stoic masculinity of medals and marching, but the private, vulnerable masculinity of whispered confessions in the dark, of holding another man's face while he wept, of leaning into someone else, not just for warmth, but to remind oneself of life. These moments, buried for decades beneath layers of national myth, surface now in academic papers, documentaries, and personal essays, revealing that what had happened in the trenches was not just about war, it was about being human when whole. Other systems collapsed. Veterans of modern conflicts found themselves reflecting on these revelations, realizing that their own experiences were part of a long continuum. Soldiers from Iraq, Afghanistan, and other 21st century war zones read the letters of World War I trench soldiers and saw themselves in the words, saw the same need for closeness, the same blurred lines between friendship and love, same complex emotional contracts formed in the face of death. Some veterans reached out to historians and archivists, donating their own letters, creating modern parallels to the trench diaries of the past. These new collections added to the growing body of work that demonstrated how war shapes the emotional lives of those who fight it in ways that transcend time and geography. Military support groups adapted to this new understanding, crafting programs that acknowledge the emotional bonds soldiers form in combat, not just as camaraderie, but as deeply personal attachments that can feel like love, can act like love, and often are love, even if those involved cannot fully articulate it within traditional frameworks. Mental health professionals specializing in veteran care began using letters from the First World War as therapeutic tools. Reading aloud the writings of men who had survived the trenches by surviving together, not just physically, but emotionally. These sessions became spaces where modern soldiers could talk about their own moments of quiet connection during battle, free from the fear of judgment. The recognition of trench intimacy also began to change how war memorials were designed and interpreted. In cities across Europe and the Americas, new monuments and plaques appeared that honored not just the dead, but the full spectrum of their lives, their friendships, their loves, their private struggles. Some memorials included excerpts from letters once hidden away, lines that spoke of longing and tenderness, of the ache for touch when surrounded by mud and death. Museums developed exhibits where visitors could sit and listen to recordings of soldiers' letters, immersing themselves in the voices of young men who had written not about victory, but about vulnerability. These experiences reframed remembrance, transforming it from a nationalistic ritual into a deeply personal act of empathy and connection. Artists continued to draw from these rediscovered histories, creating works that depicted the emotional interiors of war. Paintings showed soldiers not just with rifles, but with arms wrapped around each other in comfort. Theater performances reenacted trench scenes with a dialogue focused on fears of loss, on confessions of love made under the rain of artillery, on the psychological necessity of finding someone to hold in the dark. Films took on the subject with increasing openness, crafting narratives that portrayed trench life as not just a crucible of violence, but as a space where human connection became a survival strategy. These cultural products reached audiences who might never have studied war history, but who recognized in these stories the universal need for affection during hardship. Families, too, continued to unearth hidden stories from their ancestors. More letters were found. More photographs surfaced images of men leaning against each other, not in posed heroism, but in unguarded moments of closeness. Some families chose to share these documents with the public, donating them to museums or publishing them in collections. Others kept them private, but changed the way they told family stories, allowing the next generations to understand their ancestors, not just as soldiers, but as complex, feeling humans who had loved and suffered in ways that defied simple labels. Schools incorporated these narratives into curricula, teaching students that history is not just a series of battles and treaties, but a tapestry of personal lives, each woven with love, fear, and the desperate need to endure. Students read letters aloud in classrooms, sometimes moved to tears by the raw humanity of the words. They learned that war is not clean, that it does not happen solely on the fields of strategy, but in the small, fragile moments between individuals who cling to each other for comfort when the rest of the world is burning. These lessons changed how young people viewed love and friendship, making space for a broader understanding of intimacy that includes but is not limited to romance or sex. Social scientists began studying the long-term effects of trench intimacy on societal norms. They noted how the emotional suppression of generations of men who survived World War I had influenced post-war family dynamics, leading to patterns of silence, stoicism, and sometimes emotional distance in the domestic sphere. But they also documented how the rediscovery of these personal histories in the 21st century was helping to break that cycle, encouraging new models of masculinity that allow for vulnerability, tenderness, and emotional honesty. The broader LGBTQ+ community also embraced these narratives, finding in them a deeper historical lineage of queer experience during wartime, though scholars were careful to point out that trench love was not always about sexual orientation. It was about the collapse of rigid categories in the face of survival. The trenches were places where love happened because life demanded it, not because of identity politics, but because of human need. This nuance became central to modern discussions about sexuality, trauma and the fluid nature of human connection. Under stress, conferences were held where military historians, psychologists, and gender theorists shared research, comparing notes across disciplines to build a more complete picture of how World War I's hidden emotional history continues to affect the present. In one such conference, a historian read aloud a letter from a soldier to his trench companion, ending with the line, "If I do not survive this war, know that my last thought was of you and not of glory." The room was silent afterward, filled with the weight of truth long ignored, but finally acknowledged. Religious institutions also revisited their roles in these histories. Chaplains and clergy members studied the writings of their predecessors, reading the confessions of soldiers who had struggled with guilt over their wartime relationships, and reconsidered how spiritual care in conflict zones should evolve. Some faith leaders began advocating for more compassionate approaches to soldiers' emotional needs, recognizing that love in war is often a lifeline, not a sin. As the decades moved forward, the lessons of trench intimacy found their way into policies surrounding military service, mental health care, and even international diplomacy. Peace negotiators studied the psychology of soldiers who had learned to humanize the other through personal connection, considering how such models could be applied to conflict resolution. War memorial ceremonies included readings not just of names, but of personal writings, acknowledging that behind every death was a life filled with relationships, desires, and moments of love. The emotional history of World War I no longer lived in the shadows. It stood in the open, part of the global memory of what it means to endure the unimaginable. In the next chapter, we will explore how the integration of these truths into mainstream consciousness is changing not just how we remember past wars, but how we prepare for the emotional costs of future ones, ensuring that the lessons of trench, love, and human connection remain a vital part of our collective survival. As the narrative of World War I continued to evolve in the 21st century, the once hidden stories of trench intimacy and emotional survival became not only a part of history, but a lens through which modern societies reevaluated the entire concept of war, masculinity, love, and human resilience. The global conversation shifted further, moving beyond the artifacts and letters into active application, into how military training, post-conflict rehabilitation, and national remembrance ceremonies approached the psychological realities of combat life. Modern militaries began incorporating lessons from the Great War's emotional history into soldier preparation, not to discourage closeness among troops, but to better prepare them for the kinds of bonds that naturally form in combat environments. Officers were trained to understand that relationships forged in war zones, whether between fellow soldiers or between soldiers and civilians, are part of the survival mechanism, not deviations from military discipline. New codes of conduct recognized emotional dependency as a byproduct of trauma rather than a weakness. Mental health protocols shifted as well,